to be here, to join us by phone. I know we have a number of people on the phone today. We've put together what will hopefully be an insightful and pretty full agenda to make good use of your time. So for those of you who don't know, I'm Ed Bartholomew. I'm with Call for Action. I'm going to turn it over to Scott Marshall. Scott's with the FCC. He's our designated federal officer, and he'll go over some logistics for us.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Again, welcome. We will be looking forward to hearing from Commissioner Clyburn this morning, sometime between 9:15 and 9:30. And we also have remarks from the chairman, who unfortunately is not had another commitment out of town, as I understand it, and couldn't join us today in person, but did record remarks late last week. So we'll be hearing those two before the CGB update at 9:30. We'll provide more info on the breakout groups as we get closer to them this afternoon. You have in your packet a list of those room locations, and we'd really appreciate the working group leaders to set up the conference bridge so that people that aren't here in person can dial in on the phone. But other than that, I think that's about it. Should we do introductions?
Yep.
Ed? Great. Going from next to my right, I guess.
I'm Sarah Miller, American Foundation for the Blind.
Susan Grant, Consumer Federation of America.
Debbie Berlin, representing the National Consumers League.
Good morning. Angela Seifer, National Digital Inclusion Alliance.
Olivia Wine, National Consumer Law Center.
Thaddeus Johnson with NASUCA.
Kyle Hildebrand, individual.
Hi, I'm Alex Phillips. I'm here with the Wireless Internet Service Providers Association.
Hello, I'm Julie Carney with the Consumer Technology Association.
Hi, Louisa Lanchetti, representing T-Mobile.
Chris Stewitnowski, CTIA.
Lynn Follansby, U.S. Telecom.
Ross Lieberman, American Cable Association.
Steve Posiask, I'm with the American Consumer Institute.
I'm Barry Umansky with the Digital Policy Institute.
And again, it's Ed Bartholomew with Call for Action. Who do we have on the phone this morning?
Good morning, this is Francelo Chillo, National Hispanic Media Coalition.
Jocelyn Day, Massachusetts Department of Telecommunications and Cable.
Kevin
Free Press.
Kevin Tagline, Benton Foundation.
Paul Goodman, Center for Media Justice. East Herrera, National Association of Telecommunications Officers and Advisors, Montgomery County, Maryland.
Did somebody just join, or is anyone else on the call?
Larry Walk from NAB. Did you hear me?
Yep, got you, Larry. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Sorry, I can't be there in person today.
Well, we miss having you. So that's a good segue to brag about the wonderful food that is here in the room for those of you on the phone and aren't joining us in person. And I'd like to take a second to thank NCTA for providing food. I think that Stephanie and Steve just walked in, so just in time. Just in time to get thanked for food.
There you go. What timing?
For those of you in the room here, the internet access code is FCC 823302. And
that's capitals, FCC.
FCC is capitalized. There's food back in the corner. There's also water back there if you need to get some of that as well. I think we're ready to roll.
Okay.
All right. So the first thing up this morning, we are excited to have pre-recorded remarks from the chairman. As Scott mentioned, he's traveling today and wasn't able to join us in person, but he did prepare some remarks and record those for us. So we'll start there.
Good morning. I wish I could join you in person today, but I have a prior commitment out of town. So I'd like to share some brief remarks with you via video. Welcome to the Winter 2018 meeting of the FCC's Consumer Advisory Committee. And thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise with us. We greatly appreciate it. I also want to acknowledge the CAC's leadership team, namely the chairman, Ed Bartholomew, and the chairs of the CAC's working groups. The CAC reflects a core tenet of my policymaking approach, that the decisions we make inside this building need to reflect input and fresh ideas from outside these walls. Our staff's expertise is truly world-class, but the FCC doesn't have a monopoly on good ideas, far from it. The CAC offers a unique opportunity for consumers and industry to exchange ideas with the goal of developing solutions that work. This, your work, helps us get it right. And that's one reason I'm very pleased that you're partnering with us on tackling robocalls. As you know, it's our top category of complaints here at the FCC, and it's accordingly our top consumer protection priority. Your input is very helpful as we consider what to do about robocalls. I'm looking forward to receiving your recommendation this afternoon regarding call authentication as a key step in addressing the robocalls problem. We're also eager to get your advice on how to measure the effectiveness of our efforts to combat robocalls. The complaint process is another area in which we've been glad to hear from the CAC, and we've implemented many of your recent recommendations. For example, we've added a dedicated button on our Consumer Complaint Center landing page to make it easier to file an unwanted calls complaint. And we've also put together valuable educational materials that we can send in a single email when responding to a consumer's complaint. Another high FCC priority is public safety. I'm very glad that you chose to make public safety the theme for your meeting today. You'll be hearing from key staff at the FCC's Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau on topics such as disaster response, improvements in alerting, including geographic targeting of alerts, and Next Generation 911 service. Last week, I announced that I, along with members of my Hurricane Recovery Task Force, will travel in March to Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. We'll take another first-hand look at the recovery process. We want to evaluate lessons learned from Hurricane Maria and to prepare for the upcoming 2018 hurricane season. The FCC has taken numerous actions in the aftermath of last year's hurricanes, including advanced USF funding, E-rate support, temporary waiver of Lifeline certification rules, experimental licensing of Internet access delivered via balloons, and much more. The FCC remains committed to supporting recovery efforts and helping to restore, and in some cases rebuild, communications networks as quickly as possible. The FCC's efforts here reflect consumer protection in its most urgent form. In closing, let me thank you once again for helping to make the FCC's policies better. Our challenges aren't easy, but working together, there's a lot we can do. I hope to join you in person at a future CAC meeting, and in the meantime, my best wishes for a productive meeting today. Thanks.
So thank you, Chairman Pai, for recording those and sending those along for us. Next up on the agenda, we're very excited to be joined in person by Commissioner Clyburn. She's obviously no stranger to the room, so.
I just didn't, I skipped breakfast, so I just didn't want to be tempted by grabbing his, so I came over here. Again, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Edward. I want to start off by not only thanking each of you for your service, but as the chairman said, for highlighting public safety in today's agenda. My approach when it comes to public safety issues has been shaped by three key guiding principles. People with disabilities and access challenges must benefit. We should do all we can to educate each and every consumer about these public safety benefits, and collaboration among all stakeholders works better than litigation. Sorry, lawyers in the room. The first two principles, you may note, are at the core of this committee's mission. Since September of 2017, the FCC has addressed several public safety issues in a largely bipartisan fashion. It has adopted rules to implement two important congressional objectives or directives. The first was to facilitate the nationwide dissemination of information when a law enforcement officer is seriously injured, killed, or missing in the line of duty through the adoption of the 3-character code BLUE, B-L-U, as a new EAS event code to enable the delivery of blue alerts over emergency alert system and wireless emergency alerts, or WEAS. And last month, the Commission took another step to improve the WEAS system by allowing, through the previous administration's enhanced geo-targeting proposal, we established a deadline that requires the industry to meet that enhanced standard by November 30th of 2019. 3 hurricanes, I don't have to remind you, devastated communities in Texas, Florida, and the U.S. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. And again, I must commend the staff of the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau here at the FCC for their rapid response. They jumped into action by dispatching personnel and resources to ensure state and local governments had the help that the FCC could offer to protect their citizens and restore vital communication services. But the wireless service outages we witnessed during those disasters indicate that the Commission, all of us, may have to do more. According to our network outage reports, 5 days after Hurricane Maria's landfall on September 16th of 2017, 95.2% of those cell sites remained out of service. All counties in Puerto Rico had a greater than 75% cell site outage, and 48 of the 78 counties in Puerto Rico had 100% of their cell sites out of service. Those levels were worse than any prior hurricane outage reports, including Katrina and Superstorm Sandy. Since Hurricane Katrina struck in 2007, the Commission has been studying ways to improve the resiliency of commercial wireless networks. In 2016, we opted to monitor a voluntary CTIA-led initiative which sought to improve coordination among wireless carriers, state and local governments, and consumers in preparation for outages that result from natural disasters. I believe that the time is now for the agency to revisit this, and a great place to start would be for the CAC working with the agency's Hurricane Task Force on lessons, on developing and learning from lessons from the outages we saw during those 3 hurricanes, Maria, Irma, and Harvey. Related to the Commission's work on public safety, I would like to highlight a Commission initiative focused on bridging the broadband health divide. You may be aware of our Connect to Health Task Force, which launched in 2014 at my urging, and thanks to Chairman Pai, has continued to focus on examining the intersection of broadband, advanced technology, and health. Last December, the Commission introduced into a memorandum of understanding with the National Cancer Institute that will focus on how increasing broadband access and adoption in rural areas can improve outcomes of rural cancer patients. As an inaugural project, the agencies have convened a public-private collaboration to help bridge the broadband health connectivity gap in the Appalachia, taking another concrete step towards closing the digital and opportunities divide. So again, I would like to thank you for allowing me to share a few words with you this morning. And if time permits, even though I know there's only a 15-minute window, I will look forward to answer any questions or, better yet, listening to any concerns you would like me to take back upstairs. Thank you very much.
Questions?
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Commissioner.
But seriously, if you have any concerns, especially that, oh, I'm sorry, Angela.
There's been attention lately about the national broadband map coming out and the accuracy of the data and what we're going to do about that. Can you talk a little bit about the map?
One of the things that we have been doing and active in is making sure that there is a robust challenge process. So if an entity, anybody knows of inaccuracies, that would not be a high hurdle for them to reach. And I think being open to those checks and balances and knowing that we have a worthwhile but I hate to say it, but working some inaccuracies that are in the systems. We recognize that. We know we can't do it alone, and so I think that is one of the critical steps, I believe, to move toward accuracy.
Thank you. Does anyone on the phone have a question?
So again, we continue to look. We look forward to continuing to work with you. If we could do it alone, it would not be great. So that's why you're here. You have taken so much time away from your day-to-day schedule to inform and serve, and we, all of us, are the beneficiaries, and I want to thank you on behalf of my colleagues for doing that, because again, without you, we would be very narrow in our focus. We would not come up with the best and most robust ideas coming from industry, coming from consumer groups, coming from all of you. And again, I cannot thank you enough for your service. Have a great meeting.
Thank you. So next up on the agenda, we're very pleased to be joined by a number of members of CGB staff for an update. I believe we're going to start with Patrick. Many of you know Patrick Weber. Patrick is in charge of CGB right now and joined us at our last meeting. So
good morning, everyone. Thank you, Ed. Excuse me. I want to join Chairman Pai, who I know you saw a video from, and Commissioner Clyburn in welcoming you to this month's Consumer Advisory Committee meeting. Chairman Pai wanted me to pass along his regrets for not being able to attend in person, but he, as well as a number of other folks in the telecommunications field, are across the pond, as they say, in Barcelona this week. So thank you for your service. We say that a lot, but it's meant heartfeltly. I mean, this is a challenge, and it can be somewhat inconvenient for y'all to come in and sit here for a day and listen to the things that we do and to engage us in conversation. Sometimes these are difficult topics, and we really appreciate your dedication, your service to the public, for all you do here. So thank you again from me and from my staff as well. So Chairman Pai has already touched on many of the topics on your agenda today. Your meeting theme, which is public safety, is particularly timely in light of the hurricanes that we all heard about and some of us suffered personally from last fall, and the recent 50th anniversary of 911 service. In addition, the President recently signed Carey's Law into effect, which will facilitate the dialing of 911 services without the need to dial access numbers in advance in places like hotels. And as we all know, such facilities require dialing of 9 or other digits before you can get an outside line, and that can slow down the process for dialing 911. So, kudos for that taking place. And I know the robocalls working group has worked very hard on the call authentication recommendations that you will be considering this afternoon. And my thanks to Ed and also to Kevin for spearheading this effort. And thanks to all of you again for working on it. Next, I'll ask my members of my senior leadership team to give you updates on what we've been doing in the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau. One recent addition to our Bureau, who many of you may know, she came aboard last November, is Barbara Espin. Barbara is back at the Commission. She is overseeing our Office of Native Affairs and Policy and our Intergovernmental Advisory, Office of Intergovernmental Affairs. Barbara is traveling with our relatively new chief of ONAP, the Office of Native Affairs and Policy, this week. They're visiting Navajo Nation, so she couldn't be with us today, but I'm sure she's looking forward to joining us in future meetings. So with that, I will turn it over to Mark Stone, who will address some of the policy issues we've been working on.
Thanks, Patrick.
Thank you.
Good morning. Good morning. Mark's another familiar face.
Make sure my card is facing outward. Good morning. Good to see all of you again. I know it's been a while since we met last, so I've been working a lot on robocalls, and I bet a lot of you have been working on robocalls as well. So I want to give you a quick update on what we've been doing since you last met. The big headline for us was a November item the Commission issued relating to call blocking, the blocking of presumptively illegal robocalls. That item built on a number of CAC recommendations, so thank you for your hard work in the past and in the future on robocalls. First of all, the item acknowledged really for the first time that voice service providers are our partners in blocking illegal robocalls. The Commission authorized voice service providers to block certain categories of calls that are presumptively illegal, and that was based on probably spoofed caller ID. So what the Commission said was there's 3 categories of calls that voice providers can block before they ever reach a consumer's phone, and those are calls that, 1, have caller ID that purports to be from a number that we know from the number's owner. They do not make outgoing calls. So this is like the IRS scam where we know the IRS has said, we do not make any outbound calls from this number. If a call purports to be from that number, you should block it. The second category of calls are those that purport to be from numbers that are invalid. So think a 000 number all the way through the number. And then the third category are calls that purport to be from numbers that have not been allocated to a carrier or not been assigned to a consumer. So the Commission found that calls that purport to be from these types of numbers, highly likely to be illegal. Can't think of a good reason why a legitimate call would have that type of caller ID, and so voice providers are encouraged, although not required, to block these types of calls. And in a companion FNPRM, the Commission acknowledged its history of trying to ensure that calls are completed. That's the general policy of the Commission for a long, long time. So what the Commission acknowledged here was a need or a desire to sort of mitigate the chance that good calls would actually get caught up in the call blocking net. So it asked some questions around that. First of all, it encouraged any voice provider that's doing blocking to make sure they have a mechanism in place to avoid false positives. And secondly, it asked whether it should, in the future, require a call block challenge mechanism whereby callers that make legitimate robocalls that feel like they're inadvertently having their calls blocked would be able to identify that situation quickly, get in touch with the voice service provider, say, hey, you're wrongly blocking our calls, can you fix it? The Commission also asked a number of other questions in the FNPRM, including how it could go about best evaluating the effectiveness of our efforts in trying to ensure consumers stop getting illegal robocalls. For example, whether providers should report the number of calls they block, whether they should report the number of false positives and the like. And then finally, the Commission directed CGB in consultation with the Federal Trade Commission to issue a report in a year, roughly January of next year, on how well industry, government, and consumers are doing in blocking illegal robocalls, as well as the remaining challenges to continuing those important efforts. So that will be a big part of our work in the upcoming year, and I'm sure we'll be looking to you all for your help. So a lot of this work does track your recommendations. You all specifically recommended that the FCC authorize voice providers to block specific categories of calls, and that we be careful about trying to avoid blocking good calls. So I want to thank you for your hard work on that. And I know you all are thinking about another big portion of our work here, which is caller ID authentication. So we look forward to your work in that area as well. Thanks.
In keeping with the familiar faces theme, we have Karen Pelt-Strauss joining us now.
Thank you. There's a lot of cards up here. That's right, now I'm official. I have my name in front of me. Hi, it's great to see all of you again. So, yes, it's been a few months, so we have a lot of update. I'll go as quickly as I can. Probably the most significant that we did since the last time you met was the Commission adopted an order on hearing and compatibility, both wireline and wireless. It did a number of things, including adopted a revised volume control standard for wireline handsets to provide a more accurate measurement of voice amplification. It also implemented a provision of the CVAA, that's the 21st Century Communications and Video Accessibility Act, to require that wireline phones used with advanced communications services have hearing aid compatibility, including compatibility with VoIP phones, voice over internet phone services. It also required, and this is probably the most significant portion of the item, that all wireless handsets newly certified as hearing aid compatible include volume control suitable for consumers with hearing loss within 3 years. Many of you know that your wireless phones already have some amplification, but it's minimal. This is actually going to require compliance with a particular standard that's designed to meet the needs of people with hearing loss, and of course will end up probably meeting many of our needs and everybody else's needs when, for example, you're in an outdoor area in a public place and you just can't hear with your cell phone. You'll be able to give it that extra bump in amplification. In the video programming area, we had some rules that had been adopted in the past go into effect this last December, specifically rules revising our complaint procedures and creating a compliance ladder for closed captioning quality complaints. We adopted rules on closed captioning in 2014, and in order to if there's a complaint filed, there's several steps that one must go through, or that we must go through before we actually bring enforcement action to give the industry an opportunity to remedy the problem. On video gaming, on December 26th, we granted a final extension of a waiver for a particular class of video gaming software that can access advanced communication services such as internet, voice, and text communications. That class does not have to comply with our advanced communication services rules for one additional year. This was a series of waivers that were granted over the last several years, and we made clear that this will be the final waiver for this particular class. On video description, in January, the Media Bureau released a public notice announcing the top 10 non-broadcast networks according to Nielsen ratings. The reason that this is important is because of that top 10, the top 5 have to provide video description. That we look at the top 5 every 3 years. The top 10 are Fox News, ESPN, USA, MSNBC, HGTV, TBS, Discovery, History, Hallmark, and TNT. You may wonder why we're choosing the top 10. Well, that's because only the top 5 will be chosen depending on whether or not they have at least 50 hours of programming that's not live or near live or is otherwise exempt. So this actually allows networks, non-broadcast networks, to come forward and say we want an exemption because we don't fit into the category of networks that should be covered. Also beginning this July, just so that you know, there's approximately a 75% increase in the amount of video description that will be required to 87.5 hours per quarter. In emergency communications, since I know that that's the theme of this particular meeting, I believe you're going to hear from the Public Safety Bureau, but just so that you know, they, you may already know, that they released a public notice seeking comment on the effectiveness of emergency communications during the 2017 hurricane season. And among other things, comments were sought on the experiences of people with disabilities and how emergency communication can be improved for these individuals. And the comment period already closed on that. In addition, on January 18th, the Public Safety Bureau and DRO, the Disability Rights Office, co-hosted a roundtable about the emergency alert system to gather input about the accessibility of emergency alerts with representatives from consumer organizations. On January 31st, 2018, the Commission released an item that will improve wireless emergency alerts by increasing the geographic accuracy of these alerts. And The order also requires that WEA-capable mobile devices preserve the alerts for 24 hours so consumers have more time to review the emergency information, and that during this 24-hour period, the messages displayed must continue to be accessible to people with disabilities. On January 30th, 2018, a preliminary report was released, I'm sure you're familiar with this, by the Public Safety Bureau again, regarding the Hawaii Emergency Management Agency's January 13th, 2018 false ballistic missile alert. We have also received comments, and they're in the docket, that were very insightful from consumers with disabilities. There was a meeting being held there by the National Association of the Deaf, and so their perceptions and their perspective on what went on was very helpful and has been filed in our record. Also, text to 911 is becoming increasingly available in the U.S., and you may be aware, since we live in this area, it was recently announced that the state of Maryland is going to be one of the next states to adopt text to 911. We also have rules on real-time text. I know I've talked to you about this in the past. These real-time text allows people to send text and have the text received exactly as it's being sent without the need to press send or an enter key, which has proven to be very helpful in emergency situations. And I'm so happy to announce that as of January 1st, several nationwide carriers have actually started implementing real-time text. You can get it on some of your phones. It's pretty cool. I suggest you try it out. We're very, very excited and thank those companies for meeting the deadline and taking the step to make this available. And we're hoping that this is also useful for the PSAPs that do move to text to 911. In that regard, we did issue in November a clarification of how text to 911 or actually real-time text needs to be used when emergency services internet protocol networks are used. In those situations, the carrier is not responsible to transcode the call from real-time text to TTY. This is a technical matter, but it's important to those who deal with 911 and text to 911 and real-time text. Upcoming, we are going to be doing our Chairman's AAA again. These are awards for accessibility, awards for advancement in accessibility, and they recognize the efforts of individuals, organizations, academic institutions, and companies and agencies to make communications, products, and services more accessible to people with disabilities. The nomination period actually closes in 2 days. There's still time to get your nomination in, and we encourage you strongly to do so. We know that entities that have been recognized in the past are very happy to have this plaque on their wall, so to speak. It gives it's a good way to outreach your product or service when it's providing such accessibility. And the nominated products or services or practices must be introduced to the public between January 1st, 2017 and December 31st, 2017. And the winners will be announced again at the M-Enabling Conference this June. All nominations should be sent to Chairman's AAA at fcc.gov, and if you search for Chairman's AAA, you'll find all the information about the nominations. Finally, next to finally, relay services. There are some relay services now, video relay services, that are able to provide these services from their home. We have a trial going on, so I just wanted to let you know that became effective in October. In December, we released a public notice announcing that our user registration database to accept registration for VRS users opened up. This is a database that was required by a 2013 set of rules that the Commission adopted, and individuals must submit their information, some basic information, so that we can verify their identities. That is actually the requirements for that have gone into effect, and there's a 60-day period in which we're accepting that information. We've also been accepting requests for renewal of state certifications of relay services. The way relay services are done is they're kind of bifurcated, and there's a state component, and there are 50 states plus several territories that have their own relay programs. They have to renew their certification every 5 years. This is the year that we do this, so we've been doing this. And finally, I promise this is really finally, on Wednesday we have our Disability Advisory Committee meeting, and we know we have a little bit of overlap. We always welcome those of you who are interested in attending or watching online. The Disability Advisory Committee will also be holding a roundtable in April to talk about good technical solutions for making real-time text accessible to Braille devices or compatible with Braille devices and other assistive technologies. And that wraps it up for the disability update. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. And we'll make sure that we get the dates for that out, as well as the email address for the Chairman's Awards as part of the follow-up. Next, we're happy to be joined by Roger Goldblatt. Roger is also a familiar face here in the room, and he's going to update us on outreach and education activities.
Be any of these people?
And choose who you want. Choose who you want. It's identity theft, but we'll look.
Oh, yeah. You see, the real Roger spilled coffee on his white shirt, so he has to keep his tie right here.
Deputy grounds for dismissal, he spilled coffee.
As you all know, what we do in outreach and consumer education is a little bit different than people that you've heard, but we have a lot of things going on, and I actually call most of you on a regular basis to get ideas how we can get the word out to help use your networks. Next week happens to be, National Consumer Protection Week, and we're doing quite a few things. We're going to have like a little table outside because we want to make our employees good consumers. Let them know what they can do. We're also starting a series of, we haven't decided on the title yet, like it's similar to like The Talk or The View. Like Patrick calls it, what do you call it? Between the Palms or something. Is that what it's called? Oh, Between Two Ferns. That's right. Oh, sorry. I don't watch that much. And basically, it'll be an interview with a FCC policymaker giving good consumer tips in consumer speak. And the first one, we're picking 3 items, 3 areas where we have a lot of consumer complaints. Obviously, robocalls, spoofing, slamming, cramming, charges on your phone bills. I've been here 18 years, and that's always been one of the top areas that people call and complain about. And I think 1 or 2 other surprise topics, so stay tuned and watch it. It'll be on our webpage for a while. But we're going to have a whole series. We're building a set, handmade, no government funds used whatsoever. Another thing we're doing, I also want to reiterate, if anyone knows of any nominations for the AAA awards, there's 2 more days, and they're really nice little glass awards. They're nice. Spread the word. We're doing a series of tip cards now that we're trying to put out everywhere we can think of. We're working out a deal with the libraries, American Library Association, so our consumer information, our posters, we're starting a whole poster series. We find, no surprise to most people in the room, that people don't read as much as they should or used to, but they'll look at a poster, they'll look at a video, they'll look at an infographic. So it took us a few years, but we've come around that we're doing a poster series, infographic series, the videos. We want a whole lot of consumers to be a little bit more educated, so they know when they get a call what they should do, what they should not give out. If a utility company calls and says buy gift cards to pay your bill, don't run to the store and buy gift cards. A whole lot of it are things FCC can do, but the consumer needs to be better educated, and that's our job. We also have a deal with some grocery stores out in California that are putting our information in their kiosks. We want to go to where consumers are. We learned a while back ago, and a lot of you worked with us during the DTV transition, that we can't expect consumers to come to us. We have to go to where they're going to be. And then they'll ask questions, they'll take our information, and they'll follow up. Other than that, I really am quick. And AAA awards, we have a newsletter, which I believe, Scott, do you pass around our newsletter? Yeah, Scott's a great guy if you all don't know him. But we're also changing the focus of our newsletter. In the past, it's been, these are the things we've done in the past 3 months. that's okay. But we want to make it more forward. Like, this is what's coming up. So it gives you a chance if you want to participate, so you know we're going to give the dates for the next commission meetings. But this is where we're going to be with consumer information. These are people we're partnering with. I want to be more forward. We're really hopping in our little office, I'm kind of proud. So that's it. This really is the end of it. But thank you all. Oh, we also have something. I always wanted to say this. Stay tuned. We have a lot of things coming up on the robocall front that just wait around, and you're going to be quite impressed. Thank you all.
Well, with that teaser, do we have some time for questions? Sure. Okay. If we could remember to throw our tent cards up if you want to ask a question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
You're my tent card. Hi, Angela Seifer, National Digital Inclusion Alliance. I'm curious if, the posters, is there a way for organizations that aren't libraries but are serving communities to request a poster?
Absolutely. We're going to be putting them on the webpage to download, or if you want to order some, just contact. Well, we're setting up like a whole page of how you can order them. And they're actually very, they're cool. We want to get past, this is a government publication, this is a government poster. We want people to stop and think and read it.
And so notification of that will come through Scott to us, is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Can we get a list of topics as they're coming out to
Absolutely.
share? Great.
Yeah. And if you have ideas of other topics, like the first one is a spoofing poster. But if you have ideas that maybe we haven't thought of that people out there are confused about, we'll be happy to work on that as well.
Great. Thank you.
Okay.
Susan.
Thank you. This is all, don't go anywhere, Roger. This is great, and we have members from consumer organizations as well as state and local consumer agencies that are always looking for consumer education materials, so we'll be very excited to share that information with them. I wanted to know, are any of these materials going to be produced in languages besides English, and if not, do you have a plan for rolling out versions in other languages?
What a great question. I could have paid you to ask that question. Yes. The answer is yes. Obviously, we do everything in Spanish automatically. But lately, we've been doing 3 Asian languages, and plans are to even expand further. We don't want to, like during DTV, we did 28 different languages, and we found some of them were for show. Like, people from France really don't come here and speak only French. There were certain countries it was unnecessary, but there were certain ones that were very popular, and we're going to go back to that model. But the Asian ones came to us because there was a need. There was a whole generation, especially out west. Yeah. So if you have ideas of languages maybe we haven't thought of, we do have a contract now. We've been working with the incentive auction team because they want a lot of their consumer information translated. So we've taken control of that.
Great.
And we also, when I saw Karen, and she won't ask, everything we do is, a request for Braille, whatever, accessible in all formats. In addition, something else.
No, don't stay. Just really quickly. Sit down in order to speak. Just really quickly. In addition, we have a new ASL library, American Sign Language Library. It's actually not new. We've done several videos in American Sign Language in the past, but we're now more coordinated in our efforts, and so we now are announcing that we have an ASL library, and we did, I don't think it's ready yet, but we're working on an incentive auctions video on that.
Yeah, that's not ready yet, but we do, like, about the FCC, we have several, we've done about the FCC, we've done several topic ones, sent to auction when they're just finalizing. I think it's due in a week.
And of course, we do several of the clearly disability-related ones. So.
Debbie.
Oh, Karen, don't go away. Question for you. So with text to 911,
yes.
Can you talk about how, as it's rolled out, how consumers will get to know about it? Because I think the use of it will go beyond the disability community.
There's no question. Right. I mean, there's absolutely no question that text to 911, all we have to do is read the news to see that there are times that you need to text in quiet situations. We have a website, and you're going to be having somebody from Public Safety come this afternoon. I'm sure that they can provide it, and I'm sure that you can send it out, the link. But there's a website that keeps track of who is rolling out text to 911. And you know that we at the Commission do not have jurisdiction over the PSAPs, over the 911 centers. We only have jurisdiction over the carriers. For disability purposes, it's the Department of Justice that has to make sure that 911 centers are accessible to people with disabilities. Otherwise, it's a state and local matter. I hope that answers your question.
Partly.
Okay.
I'm just wondering if you're working with the carriers on a plan to have them notify consumers that it will be available.
Right. I think that probably Public Safety can answer that a lot better than I can.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure.
Zainab, did you have?
Karen already answered the question, so thank you.
And actually, Karen, while you're here to sort of build on that, what does happen when somebody is in a non-text to 911 service area? So maybe you're traveling and you have it at home, but it's not in the area.
Thank you. That's a really good question. So our rules require that there is a bounce back message. So if you dial a 911 center and the center is not equipped to accept text, you're going to be getting a bounce back message that says use either relay or use voice. So the presumption to date is still to use that you're not going to have access to text to 911. The presumption is try to use voice first. Only use text to 911 if you have no other alternative. Hopefully, over time, that will change, and the numbers are definitely going up. As I said, we were really excited to see Maryland and make its announcement. And again, Public Safety can speak to the many other states that have come on board, and within states, even if they haven't come on as a whole state, many cities and townships have come on. So, and we're hoping that real-time text also helps. Our rules do not require what kind of text the PSAPs have to use or can use. Again, we don't regulate the PSAPs. They can use SMS, short messaging services. They can use real-time text. But we were very, very excited to get the real-time text option out on the table because it does provide another alternative, and some locations may use both.
Any other questions in the room? Any questions on the phone? Well, before you guys run out, I do just want to take a second and say thank you very much. It's been a very responsive process with the recommendations we've made in this cycle of the CAC, and it's been fun to sort of get feedback and to interact and to see so many things that we've recommended become a reality so quickly. So thank you all.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
So next on the agenda, we do have a break scheduled. So we will...
We're ahead of schedule.
A little ahead of schedule. So we've got a full sort of 15-minute break. We'll be back in here ready to go at 10:15. Thank you.
Chris Anderson.
Okay, great.
Disaster Preparedness response, I should say. He's already here. And he says he'll take questions.
Okay.
He's got a lot of material to cover.
Welcome back from break, everyone. we're going to keep us on schedule. Next up, we're very happy and pleased to be joined with Micah Caldwell. Micah, many of you know Micah. She's been in the room many times before, and she is currently an attorney advisor for the Office of the Bureau of the Chief with CGB, and is doing a lot of work focused on consumer inquiries and the complaint centers.
Good morning, everyone. I see some familiar faces out there. So I have been in the CGB front office for a couple of years now, and I've worn a variety of hats. I think most of the work that I've done with the committee has been in the robocalls context. That used to be part of my portfolio. But since Tawana Terry has moved to the Wireline Competition Bureau's front office, I have taken over for her as the front office manager for the Consumer Inquiries and Complaints Division. And I'm Micah, as Ed said, Micah Caldwell. So I'm relatively new to this position. I'm still learning the ropes, as it were. So I don't know that I have a lot of substantive updates to provide today, other than I wanted to come down and take the opportunity to introduce myself for those of you that don't know me, and let you know that I am looking forward to working with you in the coming months. I've taken a look at the recommendations that the CAC adopted in May, and I've checked in to see what the status is on all of those. And I was pleased to see that before I came on board in this role that we've already implemented a few of them. There still are a couple that are outstanding that we're still looking into, one of which is the concept of an app for consumers who want to file an unwanted calls complaint to use their mobile device. And an app on a mobile device to file their complaint and have it, directly be funneled into the Consumer Complaint Center. And that's something we are still looking into, as you could probably imagine. That is something that takes a little bit of time. And we also want to, and I think Tawana mentioned this when she was here last fall, to make sure that we have the right strategic partner to undertake that endeavor. So that's something that's still on our radar. Another new development, other than me, is we also have a new permanent division chief of CICD. She's not down here this morning, but her name is Sharon Wright. You're probably very familiar with her because she has been the acting division chief for quite a while now, and she was appointed as the permanent division chief in January. So you've got two new faces when it comes to consumer inquiries and complaints, although Sharon's been around much longer than I have been. I'm looking here to see if there were some other recommendations that you all had adopted in May that we are still looking into. The app is the primary one. The one that we were able to implement relatively quickly was the separate button for unwanted call complaints. That's on the Consumer Complaint Center. We've actually gotten quite a bit of positive feedback to that. And we've also gotten a lot of positive feedback from consumers about some of the changes we made with respect to the content that we provide to consumers when they file a complaint. I don't know if any of you have actually filed an unwanted calls complaint yourself, but when you do that, you get an email notification that tells you that your complaint's been submitted successfully, and it's an opportunity for the commission to educate consumers about that particular issue and let them know what's going to happen next. And I think the biggest improvement that we've been able to make with respect to that sort of dialogue, if you will, with the consumer is to manage expectations a lot better. And there's been a really positive response to that. So we tell consumers, quite frankly, we can't stop every unwanted call. We realize that when you're contacting us with a complaint about that particular situation, you're already very frustrated. But we do make it clear that it's very important to us that we get this information from consumers so that we can use it as part of our complaint data, which we push out on our complaint data center, in which a lot of third-party apps and other companies and organizations use with respect to their call blocking and call filtering applications and other resources. And I think we got, as recently as 2 weeks ago, an email that went directly to the chairman that said that this person was really pleasantly surprised with the changes that have been made, and that the new complaint center is a lot more user-friendly than the previous one was. I think there's definitely still an interest among consumers to be able to file multiple numbers at a time with a single complaint on one form. That turns out to be a little bit more complicated than one might think it would be, but that is something else that we're still looking into. And hopefully one of those two ideas that we're exploring right now we'll be able to move forward with in relatively short order. I look forward to having a dialogue with all of you going forward. I'm open to ideas for ways that we can improve the Complaint Center. That's something that we're always looking at, of course, and it's one of my goals in undertaking this new position is to make sure that the Complaint Center is working to the best that it can for consumers and that they're getting the relief that they need and that they're getting the information that they need and that it's seen as an outlet or a place where they can go to actually get some resolution as opposed to continued frustration. And so if anybody has any questions that they want to ask me, I'm open to some questions. Hopefully I can answer them. And if not, then I'll turn it back over to Ed.
Sure. Steve? Hi, I'm Steve with ACI. Okay, so you just mentioned in closing there about consumers getting resolution, and I know that we want these filed in part because we want to measure the size of the problem. But what really is like the probability of some remedy or action taking place at this point? Because when I get these calls, I really don't have a number to report. So the numbers are spoofed or it's something funny. But so how does that really work? Are we just filing these complaints so we can size the problem, or is there in fact some resolution that's taking place in many instances? I just want to understand that.
Right. It may not be the individualized resolution that some might prefer, but there are a number of ways that we can use that information to provide relief for consumers sort of more broadly. One is that we use it in our policy-making decisions. We've been very active over the past year, and I think maybe Mark was in here earlier to give you an update on some of the work that we're doing with respect to unwanted calls. The data that we gather in the Consumer Complaint Data Center is used as part of that decision making and trying to figure out, how can we better inform policy so that we can make some changes that will more globally impact consumers in a positive way. Another way that we use that data, and probably the primary use for it, is for enforcement actions. And that would be something that the Enforcement Bureau would need to speak to. But they have access to all of that data, and they've also been very active over the past several months with enforcement actions against bad actors who are making illegal robocalls and doing caller ID spoofing as well.
Other questions in the room or on the phone line? I had something. So in addition to the filing multiple numbers at once, which is something that we did flag, and I appreciate the fact that you guys are still working towards that, another thing that we had teed up was possibly the ability to do a single complaint submission that would go to both the FTC and the FCC for consumers. Because right now there's sort of two different pathways to complain, and consumers may not want to have to deal with doing all of that twice, especially if they have to do it for every single call that they get on a one number at a time basis. So with the report coming up, that's sort of a joint activity. Right. I was wondering if that might be an opportunity to move the ball forward with that item as well.
I mean, that's always a possibility. We work pretty closely with the FTC to figure out ways to, coordinate and collaborate better, and that is something that we will definitely be doing in the current administration. And with this joint robocalls report, I can see that as being an opportunity to explore that some more. So I appreciate the idea.
And I will not let you leave before taking a second to thank James Brown on your team for his great work in sort of helping us to think through some of the ideas like the button on the website and actually making those a reality for consumers. So I wanted to make sure he got in there.
I will pass that along to James. James is fantastic, and I thank him as well for all of his help in making sure that we're able to implement the recommendations that you all have made. We'll continue to move in that direction.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
So next we're looking forward, Chris Anderson is joining us, and he is with the Operations and Emergency Management Division in the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau. So I have a card for you there. Here you go.
All right. Thank you.
I think this is your first time joining us here at the CAC, so hopefully we'll be kind and gentle.
Let's hope. Good morning, everyone. I'm Chris Anderson. I'm the Chief of Operations and Emergency Management here at the FCC. A quick introduction for myself. I've been with the Commission about 4 years and been in Ops and Emergency Management that whole time. I came to the Commission from an ops-centric role or job that I had with the Department of Homeland Security, looking at critical infrastructure protection more broadly and the sort of DHS-led incident management structures. So this has been my background for a while. I work within the Public Safety Homeland Security Bureau, as was mentioned, which has the overall responsibility within the Commission. We don't necessarily do it all ourselves, but we coordinate among all of the other bureaus and offices when major disasters and incidents strike. And that's what I'm here to talk a little bit about today, to give you a sense of what the Commission's role is and the kinds of things that we do during disaster response. So first of all, our role in disaster response traces its lineage, as with most things here in the Commission, back to the Communications Act, which charges, among other things, for us to promote life, safety, and national security in the use of communication systems. So we tie it back to that initial reason for being for the Commission. But how it all sort of comes together is there's a set of national level strategies, plans, and doctrines called the National Preparedness Framework, which lays out for all federal departments and agencies how we coordinate with each other and with federal, state, local, territorial, and tribal governments when disaster strikes. How does this all come together? The Preparedness Framework, in turn, looks across sort of 5 major areas: preventing disasters, protecting against them, mitigating their effects, responding when disaster happens, and then long-term recovery. So those are really the 5 components, and mostly what I'm going to talk about here today are the respond and recover pieces, which are in my portfolio. Our key partners, I think it's important to understand how the framework all comes together, and we work very closely with a number of federal departments and agencies, but primarily with FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Administration, and DHS, Critical Infrastructure Protection, and their Office of Cybersecurity and Communications. So sort of DHS proper, FEMA is technically part of DHS, but FEMA as its own entity, and then DHS are our key partners. Within that framework, what the FCC brings to the table is we have the ability to compile and analyze communications infrastructure outage and restoration information. We assign radio frequencies to our licensees. We assist with the provision of communication support to federal, state, tribal, and local governments. We conduct outreach, and we will deploy personnel at FEMA's request or direction under a mission assignment process to send people into the disaster areas to get a little bit more hands-on with coordination. So I think that's sort of a little bit of a framework, but it makes a lot more sense to sort of step through a disaster and really kind of get down to what do we do? And I'll begin, a lot of this will focus on hurricane response. That sort of has been near and dear to our hearts over the last year. Certainly the hurricane season of 2017 was unprecedented in many ways. When we think about disaster and disaster preparation, I'm going to mostly limit my remarks to as we see an actual incident coming. Either a threat level has been raised for some reason because of weather events, or we can see it coming. We track those hurricanes quite directly all summer long. I'm at the National Hurricane Center webpage first thing in the morning with my coffee every day. So we're watching them coming and predicting. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because it's sort of outside my portfolio, but it is important, I think, to recognize that many things that the Commission does in its day-to-day activities promote the kinds of resilience, redundant communications networks, public messaging, public alerting, those kinds of things that enable sort of the underpinning of a resilient communications infrastructure. But really, when I talk about preparatory activities, I'm talking about, in the lead up to a disaster. So there are a couple of things that we do. We begin to coordinate with our federal partners, DHS and FEMA, as well as industry providers, through daily or sometimes multiple times a day conference calls, just exchanging information, seeing are there roadblocks, are there obstacles to being ready for the storm or whatever the incoming incident is. We'll conduct outreach to a number of our constituencies. So we'll reach out to public safety officials, we'll reach out to service providers, broadcast associations. We have, over the last year, as hurricanes have approached, we've released a set of public notices to provide visibility into how to contact us if there are problems, how to seek waivers or special temporary authorities, those kinds of things, so that before the disaster even strikes, we've kind of refreshed everyone's memory on how to deal with those incidents. We've also set up, this is relatively new, for each of the hurricanes this year, we set up specific web pages on the FCC homepage where we could put all of the information related to a given incident so that it was easy to find in one stop, linkable from the FCC homepage to try to get that information out there. So that's sort of the preparatory phase. In the actual disaster response, I look at our role as really sort of three major things that we do. First, we promote, develop, and share situational awareness. What is the status of the various elements of the communication system? What's up, what's down, what's working, and we share that information as broadly as we can. Second, we take regulatory actions to enable our licensees the flexibility to respond to incidents and to reconstitute their communications capabilities as rapidly as possible. And then sort of the other bucket, which actually fills up a lot of our time. It's facilitating other assistance. It's things like helping communications providers get access to their transmitter sites so that they can repair them, working with FEMA on logistics issues, on everything from customs, helping get generators through customs on Puerto Rico, you name it. In terms of, so I'm going to talk a little bit more detail about each of those three buckets. Situational awareness. Probably the cornerstone of our ability to understand what's going on is our disaster information reporting system, which we call DIRS. So DIRS is an online portal that that industry members use to report to us their status after a major disaster. Normally during steady state, we have a separate system called NORS, the Network Outage Reporting System. When a disaster strikes, we will waive, NORS is a mandatory reporting requirement for certain carriers. So we will waive NORS requirements and instead encourage all of our communications providers to report in DIRS. DIRS gives us much more detailed information down to the county level about what major pieces of equipment are up, are down, what's the status of wireline, wireless, cable providers, broadcasters, you name it, and also affords them the ability to communicate more directly with us about what their needs are, what their requests for assistance are. Hey, we have this many cell sites that are down, that are on generator power, and we're going to need help coordinating to try to get fuel, those kinds of things. In addition to DIRS, so DIRS is what industry tells us. We take that information on a daily basis, we compile it, analyze it, boil it down into sort of statistical looks at how the different subsectors within communications are doing, and then we share those back out. Over this past year's hurricane season, for all of our communication situation status reports, we were able to generate a publicly available version of those reports and share that out on the website so that anyone coming to fcc.gov/Maria or any of the other named storms would be able to daily get an update on communication status. The second way that we develop situational awareness is through direct measuring and monitoring of the radio frequency spectrum, which we do in a couple of ways. During a typical response to a hurricane or another disaster, we will deploy a team, a vehicle-borne team with antenna, receiver, spectrum analyzer, who will drive to the areas of interest, sort of run the spectrum analyzer, and look at a broad swath of the RF spectrum. And what they're able to report back to us is the public safety entities that we expect to see broadcasting. Are they up? Are they down? Are the life flight dispatch frequencies active? Are the smaller police departments that we can't necessarily get to right away, are they active in broadcasting? So we're able to provide that land mobile radio look back to public safety officials in the states and in the localities. We also use that RF sensing to look at AM, FM, and TV broadcasting so that we're aware of what's available in terms of public messaging. Are there stations available where people can get news, where people can get alerts, where information can get out to the public? In addition to those deployed teams, we will use a high-frequency direction finding system that we maintain. For other purposes and other pieces of our interference resolution mission, we maintain a network of high-frequency direction finding stations nationwide. Because of the nature, particularly of AM broadcast stations, depending on exactly what the atmospherics are like and how close it is to one of those stations, we can very often sense or listen for AM radio from very great distances. So we were able to do that to pretty good effect for Hurricanes Harvey and Irma this year. We had less success, frankly, during Maria for the simple fact that one of our listening stations is on the island of Puerto Rico and was pretty severely damaged during the storm itself, so we were unable to use that for monitoring. In fact, I just got an email this morning. We had our commercial power restored to that facility just this morning, or just this weekend. The last thing that we'll use to monitor RF spectrum is a series of remote receiver analyzers that we can dial in either through old school dial-up modems or through IP connections into those receivers to be able to look and hear the radio spectrum without having to put personnel in harm's way. So we use those, for example, quite successfully during Hurricane Irma throughout South Florida to get very rapid assessments of broadcast capability post-landfall. In addition to those, sort of what industry reports to us, what we're able to sense for ourselves, there are lots of other sources for information that we use. We will routinely reach out to state 911 coordinators, check in with them on a daily basis, make sure they're not having any unidentified issues. We'll reach out through the national or the state broadcast associations. We'll coordinate with FEMA. In many cases, we're also gathering situational awareness of other critical infrastructure sectors that are important to communications, most specifically energy sector and transportation. So that's sort of the situational awareness piece. In terms of regulatory flexibility, during response to disasters, we very often see a range of our licensees need to operate in ways that are different than they normally operate. So over this last hurricane season, we issued literally hundreds of temporary authorities to different licensees for a range of things, from first responders who are volunteering to show up in Puerto Rico, but all of their radios are licensed back at their home location in New York. They need authority to use those frequencies somewhere else. And if those frequencies are busy where they're going, we need to help them find frequencies they can use. Wireless providers, many cases they're trying to reestablish not just the power and the capability of the cell site itself, but that cell site has to connect back to the rest of the communications infrastructure. And often during disaster response, you have to come up with ways to do that aren't how you plan to do it. So lots of things like microwave links to provide backhaul for cellular providers. For broadcasters, often requesting changes in status either because they can't broadcast because they're down, or they want to change or increase or decrease their power levels based on they're operating on generators, or, hey, I know I'm the only station in this area, I'd like to up my power a little bit to get a broader footprint so that I can get more information to more people. So that's the sort of special temporary authority piece. In addition, there's a range of other orders and waivers that may be required based on the situation. Anything from the simplest extending administrative deadlines where we can, not making someone who's trying to pump water out of their radio station have to make a filing that's simply administrative in nature. Looking at changing numbering rules so that, for example, when a number goes dormant in an impacted region, it doesn't get recycled and reissued right away. It can be held on to a little bit longer than our rules normally require. So if somebody evacuates and shuts down their service for a few months and then comes back, they haven't lost their phone number. Looking at how we can use, and in cases this fall, accelerate availability of USF funding to help those providers sort of have that initial infusion of cash to help fund their response activities. The next piece that a couple of other key regulatory pieces, experimental licenses. Certainly during disasters, they're very often, we're looking for any means that we can to help restore communication. So looking at things like in Puerto Rico, Project Loon ran some wireless connectivity trials under experimental licenses that we issued to provide sort of in the more rural areas, mountainous areas of Puerto Rico, to provide at least some cellular coverage. The last piece is working with, even just sort of sharing the situational awareness of regulatory actions that are in the cognizance of other regulators, but are of interest to those in the communications sector. So as a specific example from last fall, looking at the EPA waiving some of the rules that they have on the books regarding portable generators, what kinds can be imported into the U.S. mainland or U.S. territories. And they provided some flexibility broadly, but making sure that communications providers were aware that that regulatory framework had changed a little bit so that they could adjust accordingly as they brought temporary power into the islands. The last piece that we do a lot of significant work, I think, during incidents is the sort of request for assistance or information. So as you can imagine, when sort of all heck has broken loose, and people have problems that they need help with, we will often get calls from citizens, from providers, from other government agencies with communications-related issues, and we try to help in those where we can. What we see a lot of from the providers is contacting us looking for access to their facilities or sites, where sometimes they either physically can't get there because the water's too high or roads are blocked by debris, and they need help getting those roads cleared so they can get back and restore communications, or coordinating through state and local officials. The roadblocks are up, the parish sheriff won't let anybody across the parish line or across the county line. So working with them to help them understand this is really important that you allow the communications restoration teams in so that we can get radio stations back up and wireless communications back up and broadband internet services back up. So it's those access pieces. Fuel and energy, another huge issue for providers, not only getting their hands on generators where they didn't already have them, but often even where providers had generators, they're not designed to run continuously for 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 3 months, 4 months. So then it becomes new generators, generator parts, generator oil, fuel to keep those things going, prioritization for restoration, all of those elements. Now, we don't have a magic wand to make that happen. The way that those requests actually flow, we'll collect them, we'll provide a little bit of a sanity check, and as the regulator, here's the impact of this particular piece of equipment being without power. We funnel that down through FEMA to the state and locals, because the way that disaster management writ large works, all disasters are local disasters, and it really is up to the local mayor to make initial prioritization decisions about how he or she thinks things need to happen in their area. When they're overwhelmed, they will turn to their county and then their state government for help. When the state government is overwhelmed, they turn to the feds. So a big part of what this behind-the-scenes effort winds up being is helping the state and local incident responders understand the strategic impact of a given communications asset so that they can make the right kinds of prioritization decisions that are theirs to make. So if you imagine a county emergency manager or a state emergency management official trying to determine, who gets fuel, is it the hospital, is it the telephone central office, is it the, some other critical facility, we can't make those decisions. We don't have the authority to. What we can do is get those to the right place for the decision to be made with the right background information so that people can make good decisions. So that's sort of the request for assistance, request for information piece. The last thing that I'll mention, which sort of in some ways straddles the line between longer term preparatory activities and the shorter term, is the role that we have in establishing and then sort of operationalizing an agreement we have with wireless providers called the Wireless Resiliency Cooperative Framework. So the cooperative framework was adopted in December 2016 between the major wireless providers, CTIA, and the Commission, and it essentially provides a five-pronged approach for enhancing coordination during emergencies. The first thing, the carriers agreed to provide reasonable roaming under disaster arrangements where that's technically feasible. So we saw this a lot in responses to all three of the hurricanes this year, certainly in Puerto Rico over months and months, affording that roaming capability so that if Company A has a cell site restored in a given town, Company B can focus on a cell site in a different town. Each of their customers can roam onto those respective cell sites, so we get more services up for more people in a faster manner. The carriers will also agree to provide mutual aid to one another where they can and where it's feasible. So we saw this again in this past hurricane season, things like sharing logistics flights, sharing logistics shipments, sharing generators at a given tower site. Many times the physical tower is owned by one company. On the tower are antennas for multiple providers, and coordinating amongst themselves, hey, we'll put one generator there, we'll put another generator somewhere else, rather than each of us putting one generator at the same site. It's just not efficient. So that mutual aid agreement is part of the cooperative framework. Additionally, they have agreed to help municipal preparedness in a couple of ways, both in terms of coordinating with PSAP, or Public Safety Answering Point managers, 911 call centers, to ensure that they have the latest information and a rapid mechanism to coordinate with carriers to ensure that calls are able to flow to 911 centers. The next prong is consumer readiness and preparation. So CTIA, for example, has a number of outreach campaigns about how to communicate during an emergency. Basic things like, if you can't make a call, maybe you can text. How to preserve the battery for your cell phone, because even if cell service is up, if power is out, once your cell phone runs out of batteries, you lose the ability to communicate. So those kinds of consumer preparedness things. And then the last piece is the public awareness component. I had mentioned earlier the DERS reporting, the agreement under the cooperative framework to release some of that information in those publicly available reports so that consumers and the public at large have an ability to sort of track and see communication status over time. So that's sort of a quick, broad strokes of what we do during an incident. I just want to touch on a couple things. I have just a few more minutes left. In order to ensure that we captured lessons learned from this past hurricane season, we published a public notice back in December. It closed for comments in January, and actually just last week closed for reply comments, but we were seeking a broad set of inputs from communication providers, from consumers of our situational products, from consumers themselves. How did the communication systems fare? What can we learn from this last set of disasters? And while we're still sort of going through those comments to understand what the record is showing us, a couple of things are starting to jump out right away. The first is a number of responders reported the importance of resiliency measures taken in advance, everything from pre-positioning equipment to pre-positioning restoration equipment, just things as simple as, hey, don't put your generators in the basement if you're in a flood-prone area. So those sorts of resiliency measures. Lots of feedback on the performance of the wireless resiliency framework. We got lots of comments back on situational awareness overall. Certainly a number of responders underscored the critical interconnections between the communications restoration and the electric power restoration, that those are just inextricably tied together, and the importance of understanding those links is really coming through in the record. So we hope to continue to build upon that record, engaging in public discussions and working closely with our partners to sort of capture those. Sometimes I'm hesitant to use the term lessons learned, lessons potentially learned, until we have captured them, written them down, learned them, created the plans to fix problems where they exist, and to codify the things we did on the fly that, hey, that worked really well, we need to do that every time. Until we do all of that work, they won't truly be learned. But that's that's sort of a 20-minute overview of what we do in terms of restoration. I don't know if I have a little bit of time for a question or two.
Sure. Thaddeus?
Yes, Thaddeus Johnson with Nsuka. Can you talk a little bit about the coordination at the local level? You gave an example, let's just say safety reasons, a sheriff might say nobody can go past this point, but communications needs to, personnel may need to get there. Is that more of a top-down, bottom-up? The protocols are strong for dealing with local cities, parishes, as like on the state level?
Great question, and it happens sort of in both directions. So before the disasters even strike, working primarily through DHS, they do a tremendous amount of outreach to the law enforcement communities, the public safety communities. We piggyback on that and really encourage them to understand the importance not just of communications critical infrastructure, but the pipeline, the power crews, the water restoration folks, you name it, the critical infrastructure responders need to be able to get back in. So there's a baseline of outreach that goes on all the time. The sort of next step, we work with our DHS partners at the National Coordinating Center for Communications. Will typically, as a disaster strikes, they will draft letters on DHS letterhead that we're able to share with communications providers that basically say, the bearer of this letter is a communications provider seeking to restore ... Those are non-binding. That's the problem. The feds don't have the authority to say, hey, local sheriff, you have to do this. But those kinds of things can be helpful. The last piece is, as the response gears up and you have a state emergency operations center, we'll have FEMA personnel embedded there, we will have other DHS personnel embedded there. As we gear up, we'll mission assign, so we'll have personnel in either the EOC or the Joint Field Office. And it's those kinds of communication pathways that sometimes that's what it takes is, call down to our person at the Houston Joint Field Office who can walk across the room and talk to, the sheriff's office representative or a state police representative and say, we have somebody at a roadblock right now who needs to get through. Does that always work? No, because we don't have a command and control relationship that way. But we do really work hard to establish the person-to-person relationships that, A, most of those problems don't happen in the first place, and B, where they do, we can very rapidly make the chain of people, the calls and connections in order to resolve it.
Barry?
Yeah. This is not scripted. Just thought of it as a follow-on to that last question. In the wake of 9/11, a lot of the findings included that emergency services weren't able to connect with each other. Police couldn't talk to fire, different frequencies, different equipment. And with the Federal Department of Homeland Security, the FCC is a parallel bureau here. And 10 days ago in Florida, when we had the shooting at the high school, a lot of media reports have stated that the county sheriff was unable to communicate with the city police, same problem, different frequencies, incompatible equipment. It's 2018. How is this still happening?
Good question.
Okay.
And one which, obviously, with respect to the recent incident in Florida, I don't have any of the details, so I certainly can't.
Not your bailiwick. It's not a natural disaster. But I would have thought we'd have solved those problems under the federal government's aegis, working with states and localities.
So I think that's work that continues on a number of fronts. Certainly, I will dodge this a little bit. I'm not sure if our next speaker is David first?
It's
next?
2 speakers down, and we
okay.
have someone coming to address
So I will just defer to my colleague from our Policy and Licensing Division.
Right.
Other than to say that from an incident management perspective, I will add that when the big disaster comes, a huge level of effort goes into the frequency management plan, because even in those cases where it's just the state and locals who already work together on a normal basis, when you have a response like Maria or Irma or Harvey, where you have other state and local volunteers coming in from out of area with their own assigned frequencies and equipment, where you have tons of feds showing up with their own assigned frequencies, simply coming up with the frequency management plan of who's talking to internally on what frequencies and who's talking to others on what frequencies is a huge part of the level of effort of the coordination.
Good.
Do we have any questions on the phone line? Russ?
Hi, Russ Lieberman with American Cable Association. First of all, I just wanted to say, I guess, congratulations, or the activities that I've just seen come out of the FCC in the last year have been a lot of new things, it seems, and creative ways to be helpful, and so the Commission really should be applauded for its efforts this year. In terms of preparedness, I certainly want just throw out the opportunity that certainly association like mine, who represents small and medium-sized cable operators, certainly impacted, probably could benefit from more information in terms of the resources that are available through the Commission, and as well as using DERS and other things like that prior to hurricane season or other things like that. And we certainly would like to work with the Commission to find ways that we could further educate many small cable operators to know what is out there for them and how they can help in terms of addressing when disaster strikes.
Fantastic, and I will absolutely take you up on that. We are already planning for later in the spring, May, possibly into June, sort of in the April, May, June timeframe, to bring in the different industry segments for what we call, a preparedness meeting, which is really a way for bidirectional information sharing. We can tell you what we've been up to. We'll be interested to hear success stories or the kinds of things that different communication subsectors are doing to promote resiliency, or issues that, if only we could solve this, we would be able to do that. So those kinds of information exchanges are, I think, really important. And after I get up, I'm going to swing around and grab a card.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us. That was very informative. And this is clearly an issue that the Commission is spending a lot of time on these days, and I expect that we'll hear more as deliberations and sort of lessons learned processes continue.
Great.
Thank you.
Mr. Cook?
Mr. Cook. So next we're happy to be joined by Gregory Cook. He is the Deputy Chief of the Policy and Licensing Division with the Office of Public Safety, the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau here at the FCC, and he's going to be joining us today to talk about blue alerts and wireless emergency alerts.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for being here. Thanks for the opportunity. Just to give you a little bit of background, what my portfolio is public alert and warning, and the FCC regulates two public alert and warning systems. The one we're fairly familiar with both of them. EAS is the one you get over your TV and your radio, and it's the one that has that big sort of loud noise and that that you hear, and you get weather alerts and amber alerts and whatnot from that. And the other one is the alerts that you would get over your wireless telephone, wireless emergency alerts. And in both of these instances, what the FCC regulates are the service providers. We regulate the broadcasters, the cable providers, DBS, Sirius XM, et cetera, for the purposes of EAS, and the wireless providers for WIA. Now, in the case of WIA, this is a voluntary program. Wireless providers elect to participate in this program. Once they do, they have to follow the rules, however. For EAS, all EAS participants must participate in EAS because they have to be able to deliver an alert that would be delivered in the case of a national emergency by the president. So they all have to have the equipment in place to be able to deliver this message. But any other message, be it weather or amber or anything like that, is voluntary. So we've got these two systems going, and so what we've done over the last year is a number of things with both EAS and wireless emergency alerts. Now, EAS is comprised of about 25,000 participants. If you add up all of the radio and the TV stations and the cable providers and your direct broadcast satellite, Sirius XM, it's quite a bit. And so we have been, for the last couple of years, running nationwide tests of the system to make sure that everybody who is a participant can receive the test from its source and to then deliver it to the public. And the sources would be the National Weather Service or NCMEC, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children for AMBERS, or state and local government. And they get these either broadcast over the air from other sources that they monitor, or through a system known as the Integrated Public Alert and Warning System, which is an internet-based alert aggregator that is operated by the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And so we did our first test in 2011. We did our second test in 2016, and we did our most recent test on September 27th, 2017. The Commission released a public notice about the initial results on that test on December 7th, 2017, and the initial results showed that in fact the system worked as it was supposed to, and that everybody was able to participate and got the message. Now, the cool thing about where the system is evolving is that what they were testing this year are the alerts being received from the FEMA alert aggregator, and by receiving the alerts that way, they're able to receive very rich IP-based data that is put together in something called the Common Alerting Protocol. And what that enables folks to do, for example, is to receive alerts in multiple languages. So this alert was sent out in English and Spanish. It was also sent out with an extra text file so that the audio and the text could match up, so that deaf people would get exactly the same information reading it as the hearing people would from listening to it. So we're advancing this system to take advantage of IP-based technologies. And to the extent that it was received by folks, and it was mixed as to how it was received, and that has to do with technical issues in the distribution architecture, it was very successful. So that worked out quite well. One of the things that the FCC has also done in the last year is it added functionalities to the system, and the most recent one of those is what's called blue alerts. And there's a statute called the Blue Alert Act, which requires the Justice Department to act as a coordinator for the various states to come up with plans to inform the public in the case that a law enforcement officer is either killed in the line of duty, injured in the line of duty, or whose life is threatened, or who has been kidnapped in the line of duty, where the suspect is identifiable. And of course, there's a lot of internal work in between law enforcement entities that goes on with blue alerts, but also there's a public element. And so if you're going to have a public element to blue alerts, how do you do it? And how do you set it up? And how does it work in a way that's effective for the public and gets the message across without inundating people with alerts where the officer might not be necessarily in danger? That's where we came in and issued a notice of proposed rulemaking to develop a new and specific event code for blue alerts, just as you would have for tornadoes, just as you would have for a missing child, so that we would have one code that could then be applied consistently throughout the country, backed up by a certain set of guidelines that would determine the manner in which local enforcement would issue the alert. And so the Commission adopted this new code on December 14th, 2017. It's got 2 years of effective, it's going to be effective in 2 years. In the meanwhile, we continue to work with the Department of Justice, with their Community Office of Policing Services, who are the Blue Alert Coordinator, to work with them and to work with the states to get this system up and running in an effective fashion. The other system that we have is our wireless emergency alerts. And wireless emergency alerts, we've probably all gotten them. If there's a thunderstorm coming or if whatever, and your phone vibrates and makes this terrific noise, and then you see this text on this. Now that is, again, this is wireless emergency alerts, or WEA, which goes back to the WARN Act in 2006, but is something that has been up and running since 2012. And what the Commission did in September of 2016 was adopted an order to strengthen it and make it more effective. So, for example, when the Blue Alerts launched, not Blue Alerts, when wireless emergency alerts launched, the amount of text that could be carried in one was limited to 90 characters, which you really can't say a lot with 90 characters. So the Commission adopted rules to increase the maximum length of WEA messages from 90 to 360 characters for 4G, LTE, and future networks. It added new functionalities to the actual message, so that, for example, if you have an Amber Alert, you could also have a URL embedded in the alert to allow you to click onto the picture of the missing child. So adding URLs, adding callback numbers, URLs that would bring you to a callback number are added in. Initially, for technical reasons, alerts were limited, could be no greater than a county. Well, Montgomery County, Maryland's big enough, but you go out west and you got counties that are bigger than some eastern states, and you really don't want to alert the folks about the weather emergency in the northern part of the county, in the southern part of the county where it's irrelevant. It takes away from the efficiency and the effectiveness and the impact of the alerts. So what the Commission did was narrow it down to a polygon, that would be the actual area affected, as the best approximates to the polygon. Now, this is going back into 2016. What the Commission did more recently in January was narrow this even further, so that alerts that will be going out will be limited to the actual polygon and cannot exceed the polygon more than 1/10 of a mile. So it's really, really tight. And one of the ways that the Commission has suggested this might be done would be to augment the information that is delivered by the National Weather Service, for example, with intelligence that might be existing in the handset that would be able to know where it is and when it's within the area of danger to give the alert then. So we hope to be able to have a very, very tight, very accurate wireless emergency messages that give sufficient information to inform the public, give them access to other data through URLs, and only affect those folks who are really in the danger zone. What other things that the Commission has done is create a new class of alert called public safety messages. The way the system is broken out right now is that you have the presidential alert, which you cannot opt out from. If that ever comes across, you got to listen to it. Amber alerts, okay, and what are called imminent threat alerts. And imminent threat alerts are alerts that are serious, are life and property threatening, are very close to you, and are going to happen within a very quick period of time. So, for example, a tornado would be an imminent threat, whereas a hurricane that might be a serious hurricane that's 3 days out might not be an imminent threat. However, storm surge could be an imminent threat. So it puts a lot on the alert initiator to sculpt these correctly. But we find that in the case of, let's say, a tornado alert, and there's the tornado, you might want to do follow-up to it. Do you need to inform people about evacuation centers? Do you need to give them boil water alerts? Do you need to give them information that is sufficiently related to the imminent threat, but is not in and of itself imminent? So what the Commission did was adopt a new category called public safety messages that convey this essential recommended action that can save lives and property that would be associated with an imminent threat. Commission has also introduced and requiring Spanish language WIA messages, and most recently has adopted other rules that that require that the information stay on the phone. So, for example, you could get this, and you get it while you're driving, you go, holy smoke, and you go to pull over, and then you go to look at it again, and it's gone. Right now, what now is that the Commission requires that alert messages remain in a consumer-accessible format on the wireless device for 24 hours after receipt, or if the consumer chooses to delete the message. And at this point, the extended character length is 2019. Spanish is May 2019. The URLs are in place now. Spanish language would be May 2019, as well as the more narrow geographic message codes. So that kind of covers it for alerting. Happy to answer any, if there are any questions.
Does anybody have any questions? I had one, actually. The situation in Hawaii, what category did that alert fall into?
I really can't. The Commission announced results of an initial investigation at a prior meeting, and this investigation is ongoing, so I really can't comment.
Okay. All right.
Thanks everybody.
All right. We have a little bit of a agenda change. I understand that Roberto was actually deployed to Puerto Rico over the weekend and will be unable to join us here in person. So David Firth, who is the Deputy Bureau Chief for Public Safety, Homeland Security, will be joining us to cover both information about Firstnet and information about Next Gen 911.
Do you have a name tag?
I do have a name tag.
How about that?
And we'll let you if you want to run through all of your stuff and then do questions at the end, or if you want to sort of keep it segmented and break it up, happy to accommodate either way.
I think I'm happy to break it up. I'm really open to whatever it is that would work better for the group. And since we had two segments planned, there is a relationship between first responder communications and 911, which we will certainly talk about. But maybe just for simplicity's sake, to put this into a bit more bite-sized chunks, let's start with. And hang on, my phone is ringing. Nope, that's a robocall.
That's later on the agenda, actually.
No, when my phone says it's potential spam, I generally take the hint. So let me start with a very basic overview. I know that the CAC was interested in Firstnet, and I will certainly be happy to talk about Firstnet, but it struck me that maybe in order to put Firstnet in perspective, it would be helpful to go back a little bit to provide a little bit more of an overview of first responder communications. And I happened to be watching upstairs when Chris Anderson was here, and I think you asked a question about interoperability, and which I would like to get to because it's an extremely important issue. Your question was spot on, and there's a lot of history about how we got to where we are, and I think that there is both a glass half full and a glass half empty aspect to the issue of interoperability. Why don't we have it everywhere? And where we do have it, how is it that we've gotten there, and in the places where we don't, why is that? So let me just step back a little bit and talk about the FCC's specific responsibility when it comes to first responder communications as part of that larger landscape. The Commission is responsible for licensing of spectrum for all types of services, including television and cell phones and all of the things that everybody in the wireless age is very familiar with. We also license public safety radio spectrum, which is spectrum that's been designated for use by public safety, and this is something that's actually started back in the 30s and 40s when the Commission was first formed, and when law enforcement particularly started to put radios in their cars. The Commission began to license those systems, and so basically any system that is used by a local police department, fire department, emergency medical response is licensed by the Commission. And there are specific bands in the spectrum that are dedicated for public safety use, some of which are quite old. We started licensing spectrum again back in the 30s and 40s in the VHF and UHF bands. That was for some of the first of those radio systems. And these are essentially voice dispatch radio systems where typically you'll have a command center, a dispatch center at the headquarters of the police department or the fire department, and they will be interacting on the radio with people, with first responders in their cars or with portables that they're carrying on their person. And that technology goes back a long way, but it's evolved a great deal since the 30s and 40s. So all of those systems are licensed by the Commission. They are on multiple bands. As I said, the oldest systems, which we started to license in the 30s and 40s, were largely on VHF and UHF spectrum. Then, starting in the 80s and 90s, we opened up newer bands in the 700 and 800 megahertz range for additional capacity for public safety. And most of those systems have been licensed more recently. So one of the things that affects interoperability is simply what band is a given police department or fire department using for their communications, because in fact the bands differ. And I would say, generalizing a little bit, we have thousands of licensees around the country. Many of them are still on those UHF and VHF bands. Those are particularly popular in rural areas because typically UHF and VHF has better propagation over distance. And the 700 and 800 megahertz systems that have been deployed more recently tend, although not always, to be in more urban areas, suburban areas. There are statewide systems. There has been over time a trend towards, in the evolution of the technology, from what was originally analog technology to digital technology. There's also been the development in the standards and in the equipment that's available, a much more enhanced ability to have interoperability as a feature in your radio. So in fact, most radios that are deployed today are designed for interoperability, to support interoperable communications. The technology is there to do it, but often the issue of whether you have interoperability depends on whether those local and state agencies choose to do it. And that is still essentially a state and a local decision. There's been a lot of progress on interoperability over certainly the time that I've been at the Commission, and Most states now, through a program that's funded by DHS, have statewide interoperability coordinators whose responsibility is to try to bring the systems that are within the state into an interoperable frame. So interoperability has progressed a great deal, but it's still not ubiquitous and uniform. And I don't know. I know you had asked about Parkland, and I can't comment on the specifics of Parkland. I don't know exactly what the situation was there. But there are certainly instances where we see that in incident response, interoperability is, or lack of interoperability is still an issue. And that is an ongoing, it's an ongoing challenge for us at the federal level, and I think also for state and local government. And there are areas where, in fact, a lot of work has been done on interoperability. Just as a sort of historical side note, if you look at 9/11, all of the issues that most people talk about with respect to interoperability came out of New York, because it was about the New York Police Department, the New York Fire Department, and who could communicate with whom in the towers. Interestingly, you will not see a similar discussion about a lack of interoperability in the metropolitan capital region on 9/11. And historically, the reason for that is that back in 1981, when we had the Air Florida crash here in the D.C. area, that was the event that focused this region on interoperability, because that was the event that revealed the seams in all of the local systems here in the area. And we had lots of agencies converging on that incident, not able to communicate with one another. And that began a long evolution within the National Capital Region to build an interoperable framework in terms of the technology, in terms of the operations, in terms of the governance, in terms of training. And all of those things have resulted in fairly robust interoperability here in the National Capital Region. And in fact, DHS does periodically a kind of interoperability scorecard where they, I don't know that they've done one in the last several years, but I know they did one a few years back where they actually graded jurisdictions on how far they had come in terms of interoperability. And again, there's still a great deal of variation in the way that different jurisdictions respond to that challenge. So for really, I think for consumers, for citizens, you need to look at how it is working or not working in your community. The Commission can do a great deal to make interoperability possible, to ensure that the spectrum planning and the technology will support interoperability, but the Commission doesn't have the ability to make it happen at the governance and operational level where those are state and local government decisions. And that's essentially the lay of the land. Now, let me then add Firstnet to the equation, because Firstnet is a bit of a game changer when we talk about interoperability. One of the key findings, as I think many of you know, out of the 9/11 Commission was that interoperability remained a huge issue and something that still needed to be tackled. Had not enough progress had been made. And shortcutting a lot of history, one of the things that came out of that was the legislation that created Firstnet. And the vision of Firstnet was to create a nationwide public safety broadband network that would be fully interoperable and that would be governed at the national level. And so that legislation, which was passed in 2012, did a number of things. It required the Commission to allocate spectrum that would be licensed to Firstnet. It set up the governance structure of Firstnet. It set up a funding mechanism for Firstnet, which was to take funds from FCC auctions that would be dedicated to the build out of this network. And the vision was, let's have a state-of-the-art broadband network that serves public safety and that's fully interoperable everywhere in the country, which was not something that this country or really any country had ever done before. So it was a very, very dynamic way of addressing the interoperability challenge. A couple of things to note about Firstnet. One is that the vision was a broadband network that would primarily, at least in its first iteration support data, would not necessarily support voice. If you talk to first responders and if you look at the equipment that they have, I mean, typically now most of them still are relying primarily on voice communications in their vehicles with their the radios they carry with them, and often they will also have their own iPhone or Android, their own smartphone that they carry as a second device, because those radio networks that have been licensed for decades, they're voice networks. They are not data networks. And so one of the visions of FirstNet was, let's create the opportunity to afford public safety the ability to also access data, because there are all kinds of situations where, as first responders are coming to a scene, data as well as voice communications could be very important to the response. So that was the vision behind FirstNet, was to require it to use commercial broadband technology. FirstNet is required under the statute to use the same LTE technology that is used by the major carriers. Anybody here with a smartphone, you're probably, if you're looking at your data on your smartphone, you're probably using LTE to do it. FirstNet is based on the same platform. What is different about FirstNet is, number one, it has dedicated spectrum that is licensed to FirstNet. So they are not required, they are not limited to operating on commercially allocated bands. That means that in an emergency, FirstNet can go to capacity that is dedicated to public safety. And even if you have an emergency where everybody gets on their cell phone, everybody is loading up the system, there is dedicated spectrum that FirstNet has access to that is priority spectrum capacity for public safety in that emergency. And that's again, that's a real game changer from what we've had in the past. So that's one aspect of what kind of makes FirstNet unique. Another is the way that we're now seeing FirstNet roll out, because the concept was developed in 2012 in the legislation. We are now at the point where FirstNet is actually beginning to deploy and provide service to public safety. They entered into a contract with AT&T. There was a competitive process with in which vendors had the opportunity to bid for the FirstNet contract. AT&T was the winner in that process. So FirstNet and AT&T are now partners and are building the network. Public safety will have access to AT&T's commercial spectrum, but will also have access to this dedicated band of spectrum that's allocated for public safety and specifically licensed to FirstNet. There was in the legislation an option for states, if they wished, to opt out of FirstNet and to build their own networks, provided that they were interoperable with FirstNet. We opened a window that allowed any state, if they chose, to elect that option. In fact, no state did. So we now have and we now know that FirstNet will be deploying and building the network in every state and in all the territories. And that's happening now. And I think that what will happen, what the benefits of that will be for public safety, to some extent it remains to be seen, because we're now at the point where the FirstNet network is being deployed and public safety is not required to use it. FirstNet is going to go out and have to win public safety customers, and they're in the process of doing that. But it provides an option for public safety that public safety hasn't had before, which is access to a broadband network that's fully interoperable across the country, and that provides capacity in emergencies to public safety, regardless of how congested the commercial networks are. So it provides the potential for a much improved response to emergencies, and because it is being built across the country based on standards that have been articulated for interoperability, it will be fully interoperable across the country. And that will be a major change in the environment for public safety. So with that, let me stop for a second and just ask if there are questions about first responder communications, about interoperability, about FirstNet that I can answer, and then we'll switch over to 911.
Thaddeus?
Yes, in situations where systems don't talk to each other, is it more of a situation, a problem of different hardware providers or technical standards? And I'm asking because I'm thinking about sunk costs. If a city, county, whatever, puts $200,000 into system A and system B is better, like how many years are going to have to go by before they upgrade to something if the problem is the provider or a technical standard?
It's really going to vary. I think the one thing that's a constant is that when agencies are making decisions about what equipment to buy, about what system to implement, they're making a long-term decision about what the investment that they're making. And because typically when let's say Washington, D.C., or Montgomery County, or San Francisco, or Dallas, Texas, goes out and buys a radio system that they're going to be using for their first responders, they should be looking at all of those issues, because that's a system that's probably going to be used for a number of years, possibly more than a decade, and so it's important for jurisdictions to ask those questions. It is. And the answers to the questions and the choices they make may have consequences. As I said, in general, the technology at this point that is available when a jurisdiction is going out and looking at what to acquire, what to purchase, supports interoperability. It should not be an issue of whether there is a standard that supports interoperability. But there are still issues that you have to think about in terms of the cost of the system, the functionality of the system, and who within that community are you going to be interoperating with. And that's a matter of planning, of deciding in advance that not only do we have a system that's capable of interoperability, but we're going to work with our neighbors to program that into the radios. It starts with as simple a thing as deciding what channels are we going to all use. If we are in a situation where we're doing joint response to an incident, that's, again, to take National Capital Region as an example, that is something that they spent an enormous amount of time on planning, so that because you have many incidents here that are going to have multiple jurisdictions converging on a scene, and you have to have planned in advance how you're going to use the technology to support interoperability. What channels are people going to use if they're from different jurisdictions? What channels are you going to use to speak to the people within your own organization? How is that all going to be managed? The technology will support any way you want to do it, but you have to decide how to do it. And then beyond that, there is the question of planning and of training. If you look at the interoperability criteria that DHS puts out, they put out something called the Interoperability Continuum, which is a kind of a 5-step analysis of how do you get to full interoperability. Only one of those 5 steps has anything to do with technology. The other 4 have to do with operations and governance and training. And so I think that tells you something about how complicated this decision is. It's very important. It's critical. But it's not just a question of what radio do I buy.
This is Mitzi Herrera on the telephone. Can I chime in on this?
Sure.
So it is true that, particularly in the National Capital Region, that we have been working on interoperability since 1991, when there was a plane crash in the Potomac River, and that's what first brought the problem to light. So I think that there has been a lot of coordination. It is multi-state, multi-jurisdictional, federal, state, and local. But what I'm curious about is almost all of that work has been done by the local governments in partnership with some of the state to have that happen. But there hasn't, as far as I know, been that much technical expertise provided by the various federal agencies, either by FCC or Homeland Security. The drivers have really much been the local do. And in some places where you'll have places like, say, a Kansas City, where you have a city that sits in two states, you have a lot of people who are used to working together, and I think that the interoperability is improved. But in other places, and somebody had mentioned previously the recent shooting in Florida, where you have agencies in which they just haven't had to work together across those different jurisdictions, does the FCC, are you doing anything to either have a checklist or a task list, or is there some kind of identification of where these interoperability is working well? Are there guidelines? What is happening in places where you are not at the center of the nation's capital with 20 or 30 years of experience doing this?
Well, let me talk about what the FCC does, and then also a little bit more broadly about what resources are available at the federal level, because a lot of this actually takes place outside the Commission, but with agencies that we coordinate with very closely. When we allocate spectrum and license spectrum, we, in some instances, will require the use of equipment that incorporates standards for interoperability. But we don't go out and monitor. We don't have the resources to go out and monitor what jurisdictions actually do with the technology, with the radio systems that they operate. Our primary concern is to make sure that they're not interfering with one another, that they're complying with our technical rules. Now, having said that, there are a lot of resources that are available at the federal level. In fact, within DHS, there are several parts of DHS, their Office of Emergency Communications, that provide technical assistance, that provide grant funding on these very issues. So there's actually a fair amount of federal technical assistance that's available to jurisdictions that want to address interoperability issues. But the underlying fact is that most first response, most emergency response in the U.S. is provided at the state and local level. And there are a lot of advantages to that in terms of how effective that response is for those communities and for people in those communities. What that also means, though, is it's very difficult to impose a top-down solution when it comes to interoperability. It really has to be developed from the bottom up. And part of that is for the reason that you point out, which is that the solutions are going to differ in every community. It's going to be a question of thinking what kinds of incidents are we going to be needing to respond to, both on a regular basis and in an extreme situation, and what are the other agencies that are going to be coming on the scene in an incident that is one that crosses jurisdictional boundaries, for example. That kind of planning really has to happen at the state and at the local level, because that's where the response agencies are. And they are in the best position to figure out what it is that's going to be responsive to those community needs. So it is frustrating because not everybody engages in that effort, and there will always be incidents where you discover perhaps a seam that you didn't anticipate. It may be that interoperability works well for 99% of the incidents that you respond to, but then there's that 1% where something happens that you realize you haven't adequately prepared for. And that's the challenge, I think, for everybody at all levels, is to anticipate what the interoperability requirements are going to be, who is going to need to interoperate with one another. I can give you an example in terms of an issue that the Commission looked at a few years ago, which was making public safety channels available to law enforcement that operates on railroads. If you think about it, think about a rail accident. It could happen anywhere on the rail line. So it could happen anywhere across thousands of miles of railroad infrastructure. And there may, if there is law enforcement, if you have railroad police on the train, are they going to be able to interoperate with whoever is in the local area in order to be able to respond to that disaster? And it could be anywhere. So what the commission did was to authorize railroad police to use the same interoperability frequencies that local public safety agencies use. So at least they all have access to the same channels. Because until we made that rule change, they couldn't even use the same channels. Once we've done that, then the challenge is, okay, you have the ability to use the same channels. The railroad police do, along with state and local law enforcement. Then it's a matter of how do you plan for that incident. And the likelihood of an incident happening in any one jurisdiction may be very small, but it's something you have to anticipate if you have railroads coming through your jurisdiction. So the commission can set the table for an interoperability solution. And we can encourage and advise people to plan for those kinds of incidents. But ultimately, it's going to be up to the responsible agencies to come up with a plan so that if that happens, they will be prepared.
Thank you. I think we're ready to segue to Next Gen 911.
Okay. So we're going to switch now to 911. And I actually think about 911, what we've been talking about and what we're about to talk about as parts of a continuum. Because if you think about an incident, often that incident will start with somebody making a 911 call, or maybe multiple people making 911 calls. So something happens, a traffic accident, a fire, a medical emergency, and you know that at the end of this process you want first responders there on the scene to respond to that emergency. And we've talked about the first responder side of it. How do they communicate with one another in order to get to that emergency and provide the proper response? But now we talk about the front end, which is how does the public communicate with emergency responders in the first place in order to get help? And the 911 system is our answer to that question. Some of you may have seen some press coverage a couple of weeks ago because 911 celebrated its 50th birthday, the 50th anniversary of the first 911 call, which happened in Alabama in February of 1968, was just a couple of weeks ago. And so the 911 system has been around for a long time. And I will talk a little bit about next generation 911, but before doing that, again, I think it's worth stepping back to think about how 911 has evolved. So the original 911 system, when 911 was first identified as an emergency number in the late 60s, was essentially a system that was built to use landline telephones. At that point, cell phones didn't exist yet. The internet didn't exist. All of the technology that we're now used to did not exist. So 911 was originally developed basically to work with landline telephones. And for the first couple of decades, that's essentially what it did. And the concept was you dial 911 on any landline telephone in the country, and it will get you to a 911 call center, what we call a public safety answering point, or PSAP, in your area, and they will then be responsible for dispatching help to where you are. As the technology that we all use to communicate has evolved, the 911 system has had to keep up. And that's been one of the challenges, because again, 911, like what we've been talking about, like what we've when we talk about public safety radio systems, 911 is a service that is provided at the local level. We have somewhere north of 6,000 911 call centers in this country. Most of them are run out of county, city government, often out of the police station. Most of them are very small. Some are essentially a couple of telephone stations in a police station. Obviously, there are some 911 call centers that are very large. If you go to the D.C. 911 call center across the Anacostia River, it's a marvelous state-of-the-art call center, takes about 1.3 million calls a year, and is a really tremendous facility. And in other urban areas, you will see that. But again, 911 is something that is provided at the local level. The Commission's role in 911 has, from a regulatory point of view, been not to regulate those state and local governments that provide 911, that answer the calls, but to regulate the way in which commercial carriers that we all use to contact 911 to make sure that they support 911, so that if I am in some kind of distress or there is an emergency that I need to contact 911, I'm going to be using a commercial I'm going to be using a commercial service to dial that number. Actually, I'm not dialing it anymore, even though we still talk about dialing 911. So as I said, the 911 system started really as a landline system. Then as cell phones came to the fore and became ubiquitous, 911 had to adapt to be able to support wireless 911 calling. And a lot of the regulatory activity that the Commission's engaged in has to do with how to ensure that the carriers, landline carriers and then wireless and VoIP carriers, support 911, so that if you make a 911 call, it will get through to a call center that can provide provide help. But that's meant technologically changing the system through all of these different phases. And where we are now with what we call next generation 911, and if you Google it, you'll see a whole lot of different things. And I'm going to oversimplify a little bit, but next generation 911 really, there are kind of two basic components to it. One is that as communications technology has moved from what we call circuit switched kind of telephony technology to IP, Internet Protocol-based technology. It's the technology that's the foundation for the Internet and for most of the commercial communications that we're all engaged in all the time. As the communications platforms have become IP-based, next generation 911 is in part about ensuring that the 911 system also becomes an IP-based system and makes that migration from the kind of legacy telephone technology world that it started in to an IP-based platform. And there are a lot of different pieces to that will ultimately should make no difference to what happens if you make a 911 call. If you make a 911 call, do you care whether it's going over a landline circuit switch system or going over an IP-based system? No. What you care about is that somebody answers the phone, they know where you are, and they can get help to you. And so the vision of doing it over IP is in a lot of ways something that consumers should never have to see, because it should work seamlessly the way 911 always has worked. But the challenge of actually accomplishing that upgrade is an enormous challenge. It means new technology. It means new technology both on the carrier side and on the call center side. And it also means overcoming the funding challenge. How do you pay for it? So there are a whole host of issues that are associated with how do we make that conversion from telephony to IP-based. That's one aspect of next generation 911. The other is actually something that consumers will see, which is how do you communicate with 911? The concept of calling 911 is still essentially you can make a voice call. Most of us, and certainly, I've got kids in their 20s, they're texting, they're doing all kinds of things. Often the last form of communication they are using is voice communications. And so the other aspect of next generation 911 is expanding the 911 system so that it will continue to support voice. Voice continues to be very important, but so that it will also be able to support other ways in which people communicate, by text, by being able to send photos and video and data. Right now, in most parts of the country, if you call 911, you cannot do something as simple as send a photo to the 911 call center. And the Commission, about 4 years ago, adopted rules that required carriers to support text to 911. so that you would, if you had a situation where, for example, it could be a couple of things. One would be, let's say you're someone who has a hearing or a speech disability, so making a voice call is difficult. There's old technology called TTY that's been out there for a long time that was designed in the 70s and 80s to support that, but now we are in a world where text is ubiquitous. So the Commission said 4 years ago, let's have carriers that offer text to their customers support the capability to use text to contact 911, which will help the disabilities community. It can also help in certain situations where maybe a voice call is either not possible or could be dangerous to the caller. If you think about a domestic abuse situation, if you think about an active shooter situation, there are a number of instances where it might be preferable from the caller's point of view to text rather than to call. The Commission mandated that for the carriers. We did not mandate that for the call centers because we don't have jurisdiction to do that. They are local and state governed entities. So that's been an evolutionary process of encouraging communities around the country to adopt text to 911, to increase the functionality of their 911 systems so they will support text as well as voice. We're now at a point where about a third of the counties in the country support text to 911. There are more that are doing it. There was the District of Columbia went live with text to 911 last year. There was an announcement, I believe last week, that the state of Maryland will be going live with text to 911 within a few months. So it's gradually spreading around the country. But again, that upgrade, and upgrading to text to 911 does not even require full upgrading to next generation 911. That's still something that has to happen in all of those 6,000 call centers around the country. So it's not going to happen overnight. But at the end of the process, what we envision with next generation 911 is that it's a system that will support all of these functionalities. It will enable anybody who needs to call to still be able to communicate by voice with the call taker, but also potentially to send important information like a photo or a video of an accident scene, or to be able to text if voice communication is not called for in that situation. So that's also part of the evolution to next generation 911. It requires a lot of action at different levels of government, because there is no one agency, including the FCC, that has jurisdiction control over the entire system, the entire ecosystem. But it's an extremely important endeavor that we are very focused on doing whatever we can to help to move that migration forward. So I think with that, again, rather than talk more, let me just take questions if people have questions about 911, next generation or otherwise, or specific questions about some of the Commission's initiatives.
Anyone with questions in the room or on the phone? So I know that one thing that we all see on our phone bills is a fee for 911 services, and Commissioner O'Reilly recently put out a statement asking local municipalities to be a little more transparent with that. Can you maybe talk about the Commission's role in that? And
Sure. Well, Commissioner O'Reilly was commenting on something that we reported, because the Commission, and in fact our Bureau, is responsible every year for submitting a report to Congress on 911 fees. This is something that Congress required us to do in a law that they passed about 10 years ago. And to step back, the fees that you see on your phone bill, whether it's your landline bill or your wireless bill, those are set by the state. And in some instances, there may be fees that are also set at the local government level. But every state has the ability to decide if they're going to require a fee or a charge to go on consumers' bills to support 911. And most states do that. What Congress asked the FCC to do was to go out every year, gather information from the states about their fee collections and their fee expenditures. And so that's what we do every year, and the report comes out. We send it to Congress at the end of the year and generally publish it in January. And so we published our most recent report a few weeks ago. One of the reasons that Congress directed the FCC to issue this report was out of a concern with fee diversion, which is some states will collect that 911 fee and then will spend it on other things, not on 911. And that was an issue that concerned Congress, which was one of the key reasons that they directed the Commission to issue a report. So one of the things that we do in that report every year is we identify which states are spending their money on something other than 911. And although it's a minority of states, there is I think this year it was 6 or 7 states, I think 6, that diverted fees. And it's in our report. And that's what Commissioner O'Reilly was sending a letter to those states about. Essentially, he's saying to them that he wants, and I think he actually sent it to both the states that were identified as diverting and also to states that had failed to submit a report to us. We go out and we collect data. We try to collect data from all 50 states, but we don't always get data from all 50 states. There are usually a handful of states that don't report back to us. So Commissioner O'Reilly has sent the letter to both the non-reporting states and the states that have been identified as diverting funds, and in an effort to try to combat this phenomenon of fee diversion. So we're going to continue to issue this report every year. We'll do another one next year, and it's therefore an important source of information. And I think it's something that this committee, I would certainly recommend it to you. We'll provide a link to the report and to past reports. In addition to information about fee diversion, it provides a lot of other useful information about how money is being spent in every state. There is an aggregate of about $2.6 billion collected in 911 fees across the country. The amounts vary from state to state, and the way that the money is spent varies from state to state. But there's a lot of useful information that you can get out of that report about your individual states and also what trends are nationally.
Thank you for joining us today. I appreciate having you.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
So next on the agenda, we have a break for lunch. But before we do that, I had a couple things. Larry, are you still on the phone? I wanted to give you a chance to mention the NAB event that was recently convened around disaster response. So maybe I just called Larry out for jumping off the phone for lunch early. But I will plug their event. Earlier this month, they had an event called Eye of the Storm, which focused on the way that broadcasters, the FCC, FEMA, and other agencies coordinate efforts to cover disasters that are occurring, weather events and otherwise, and also respond to those. There is a video link for that event that we'll send around with the rest of the meeting packets, and if you're interested, you can take some time and watch that and learn a little bit more about sort of the day-to-day of disaster response and planning. We did have a couple people pop in after we did intros this morning, and maybe a couple people joined the call, so I just wanted to really quickly let those of you who didn't get a chance to introduce yourselves at the beginning of the day maybe take some time to do that now. We'll start with Alan, maybe.
I'm from the Electronic Privacy Information Center based here in D.C.
Okay, great. Thanks. Kate.
Hey, Katie McAuliffe, Americans for Tax Reform and Digital Liberty. Hey.
And I think...
Good morning, this is Zainab. Yeah. Oh, sorry, you want to go first? I'm Zainab El-Kebsi, National Association of the Deaf.
Thanks.
My name is Francelo Chillo from the National Hispanic Media Coalition. I introduced myself this morning on the phone.
Yeah, exactly.
Thanks.
Good to put a face with the name. Anybody else on the call that joined?
Hi, this is Maureen Mahoney from Consumers Union.
Hey, Maureen. So quick reminder, at 1 o'clock today, we are going to be considering a a recommendation. So that'll be a vote, and I'm hopeful that as many of you as possible can stick around for that portion of the day. We will need a quorum to get that passed, so we look forward to your participation there. And we'll take a break for lunch and be back here at 12:30. Thank you.
Presentation momentarily. You ready to rock and roll? Or you need more time?
No, I'm
You all right?
ready.
Okay.
What time is it going to
You'll be fine.
Welcome back, everyone.
It's a good group. It's really good.
Before we get rolling, I wanted to take another second to acknowledge NCTA and their generous contribution of food for all of us today. So. Next up, we're going to be joined by Evan Baranoff.
Yes.
He is an attorney advisor for the Policy Division in the Media Bureau, and we're going to learn a little bit more about ATSC 3.0 and next steps.
That's right. You just took my first slide.
Hi. Yes, I'm Evan, and as you said, in the Media Bureau Policy Division, and that's right.
Raise your hand to let them know that your mic needs to be.
Do you have a mic, or do you need me to slide this one over?
Hello?
Oh, there you go.
Is that working?
Now you're
Is that working?
yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
You
So
pretty much have to eat that mic, though.
okay. All right. So my slides will cover the report and order, the further notice, briefly, and the post-adoption issues, including next steps in the rulemaking. In November of last year, the Commission released a report and order and the further notice of proposed rulemaking, authorizing broadcasters to use the next generation broadcast transmission standard called ATSC 3.0 on a voluntary, market-driven basis while they continue to deliver current generation service, ATSC 1.0, to their viewers. It's voluntary and not a mandatory transition. ATSC 3.0 has enormous potential. It is the first transmission standard to combine the advantages of broadcasting and the Internet. It enables enhanced and innovative new features to consumers, such as ultra-high definition picture and immersive audio, superior reception, advanced emergency alerting capable of waking up sleeping devices, mobile viewing capabilities, more localized programming, interactive educational children's content, enhanced accessibility features, and other enhanced features. Local simulcasting is the key to protecting viewers during next-generation TV deployment. Next-generation TV stations must simulcast their primary video programming stream of ATSC 3.0 channels in 1.0 format. Because ATSC 3.0 is not backwards compatible with 1.0 equipment, the Commission requires local simulcasting to ensure viewers can continue to receive their existing ATSC 1.0 service. Local simulcasting will be accomplished through voluntary partnerships involving 2 or more stations in a market. Coverage and licensing requirements. A 1.0 simulcast channel that is moving to a host station must continue to cover its entire community of license. Applications that do not result in a loss of more than 5% of the existing population will receive expedited processing within 15 business days. Other applications will be processed in about 60 business days. 1.0 and 3.0 channels broadcast on a partner host station will be licensed as temporary second channels of the originating broadcaster. NextGen TV broadcasters will be authorized for both its 1.0 and 3.0 channels under its existing license. The programming on the primary 1.0 simulcast stream must be substantially similar to that on the 3.0 primary stream. That is, it must be the same except for features based on enhanced capabilities of ATSC 3.0 technology. Also, advertisements and promotions are excluded. This requirement sunsets unless the FCC acts to extend in 5 years. The order afforded a blanket exemption for LPTV and TV translators from the local simulcasting requirement. Also, we will consider waivers from aspects of the local simulcasting requirement from full power and Class A stations on a case-by-case basis. MVPD carriage rights. Next Generation TV Broadcaster's 1.0 simulcast channel will retain mandatory carriage rights while the Commission requires local simulcasting, and its 1.0 3.0 channel will not have mandatory carriage rights. 1.0 channels moving to a temporary host facility can retain mandatory carriage rights provided they continue to qualify for such rights at the host facility location. These channels cannot gain new carriage rights as a result of their new location. Voluntary carriage through retransmission consent agreements is left to marketplace negotiations. Consumer education will be crucial to the successful deployment of Next Generation TV service and simulcasting of ATSC 1.0 service. Consumers will need to be informed if the stations they view will be changing channels, and consumers will need to be encouraged to rescan their receivers for new channel assignments. All stations that move their 1.0 channel due to 3.0 deployment must air daily on-air consumer education, PSAs or crawls, beginning 30 days prior to the date that the stations will stop broadcasting in 1.0 on their current channels. With respect to the ATSC 3.0 further notice, the further notice raises 3 issues related to local simulcasting. Whether more guidance is necessary with respect to exemptions and waivers of the local simulcasting requirement, whether to allow full power broadcast stations to temporarily use vacant channels to facilitate the transition to 3.0. And the further notice tentatively concludes that local simulcasting should not change the significantly viewed status of Next Generation TV stations. Now turn to post-adoption issues. Regarding the further notice, we are now within the comment cycle of the further notice. Comments were due February 20th. We have received 19 comments as of last week. Replies to the comments are due March 20th. The report and order generally will take effect March 5th, except for the simulcasting rules, which includes the licensing process. So what does this mean for Next Generation TV deployment? Well, the new licensing rules require OMB approval and will also need changes to our LMS database. We expect to have obtained the necessary approvals and completed the changes to our LMS database by the beginning of next year. To the extent parties show a need to begin ATSC 3.0 deployment sooner than that, we are contemplating using our special temporary authority process to consider such applications. We are aware of 2 market trials, the Pearl TV Group in the Phoenix market and the Sinclair Group in the Dallas market. There have been informal discussions at the staff level about these trials, but nothing yet has been formally filed with the Commission. I'll now turn it over to some questions, if there are any, on the issues, or next steps.
Real quickly, what were the test markets that you just mentioned?
So the Pearl Group in Phoenix, and in the Phoenix market, and Sinclair in the Dallas market.
And has anyone approached the commission about trying to coordinate this with the existing repack efforts related to the auction?
I'm not sure entirely how to answer that question. They can file, you know.
Okay, but no one has filed, and there hasn't really been any.
That's right. There's just these two market trials that we're expecting.
Okay. And do you know if any? I know in Puerto Rico, for instance, they sort of accelerated the timetable on certain retuning things as a result of the hurricane and getting the towers back online. I'd also be curious to know if anyone else that was recently affected in a similar way is thinking of taking the opportunity while a tower's powered off for other reasons outside of everyone's control to consider.
No, not yet. I mean, consumer devices aren't to receive 3.0 isn't expected until 2020, so we're not sure how the timing of the rollout is going to be.
Sure. Any other questions, Steve?
That last point.
Yes.
That's sort of the reason why of my question is, what exactly do consumers need in terms of equipment? And how does that work? I mean, are they using that equipment connect to like Wi-Fi in the home? I mean, how does this work?
There's a variety of equipment. I mean, first, the local simulcasting will be key to consumers so that they can continue to receive television service with their existing equipment, with their existing televisions. For any that want to take advantage of this, they'll have to obtain a receiver, a converter box of some sort, whether to the television or perhaps a gateway device to the internet to access the ATSC 3.0 signals. Does that answer your question?
Rick?
Rick Elrod, Fairfax County for NATOA. Following up on the same line, is the 5-year sunset based on the assumption that consumer equipment will have turned over by that time and everyone will have 3.0 receivers?
The sunset is not to the local simulcasting requirement, but just to the substantially similar requirement. So in 5 years, the commission will just consider whether the programming needs to be the same or whether it can be or whether allowed to expire on its terms.
Hi, my name is Francella Ochoa. I'm with the National Hispanic Media Coalition, and I just had a question about the Consumer Education Fund legislation that's basically on the floor right now. I'm not entirely sure if you're the right person to ask, but if you are, if you could give me any Oh, okay. Well, then
I don't have any insights into that.
Oh, okay. Well, then we'll talk later.
Sorry. But
okay.
Anyone on the phone have any questions? All right, thank you.
Sure, thank you.
So next we have a slight modification to the agenda. Rather than Karen Schroeder joining us for a presentation, we're going to be joined by Kurt Schroeder. I've been told there's no relation. And Kurt is the chief of the policy division at CGB, and he's here to give us an update on unwanted call blocking and the PRM about measuring effectiveness of call blocking standards, which should lead to the joint report by the FCC and FTC on the issue.
That's right. Thank you.
Just give it, I think that mic.
Okay. Is that better? Okay.
Yeah.
I guess
your presentation is on that laptop.
Yeah, so it should be, and you have a clicker there to go through the pages.
Okay. That's not me. Let's see.
I think it's
Yeah. Here we go. There we go. All righty. Yeah, thanks. I hope you're not too disappointed that Karen Schroeder isn't here. I'll try to live up to our joint name and do as well, at least as well as she would have done, and she would have done very well. The commission adopted in November at the November 2017 commission meeting a report and order and further notice of proposed rulemaking. Thank you. And let's see, is that coming up right? Yeah. As you might guess, that document included new rules, a further notice of proposed rulemaking, and then also directed the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau in conjunction with the FTC to do a report on the state of call or the state of robocalling in the country as we see it now. The new rules allow voice service providers to block certain types of calls, and those rules went into effect just a couple of weeks ago on February 12th. Voice service providers may now block calls that appear based on caller ID to originate from first do not originate numbers. Those are numbers where the subscriber, the actual subscriber, has requested the blocking of outbound calls purportedly from those numbers that are used only for inbound calls. A well-known example of that kind of blocking involved the IRS scam that probably a lot of you are familiar with. The IRS asked that toll-free numbers that they used only for inbound calls from taxpayers be blocked if they were showing up on outbound calls that were going to people. And that, as I understand it, that blocking has been fairly successful in tamping down that scam, although I don't think it's gone away completely. Also, invalid numbers, for example, if all zeros comes up on caller ID, that's something that can be blocked because there isn't a valid all zero number under the North American numbering plan. As far as I know, the only number, repeat number that is valid under the North American numbering plan is the so-called all eights number, which is highly sought after and has even been subject of some litigation because of that. But in any event, there are also unallocated numbers. The number hasn't been allocated to a service provider by the North American Numbering Plan Administrator or the pooling administrator. If it's known that a number hasn't been allocated, there's no valid reason it should be showing up as the originating number for a call. And then unused numbers. Those are numbers that have been allocated to a service provider but not assigned to a subscriber. Commission adopted these rules to give the industry some flexibility in blocking illegal calls. The blocking is voluntary. We hope the industry will get on board and do what they can to block these kinds of calls, but we're not requiring carriers to do that. The rules, we think, outline very specific, well-defined circumstances where voice service providers can block calls that are highly likely to be illegitimate because there's no lawful reason to spoof those particular kinds of phone numbers. Moving on to the further notice, that's part of the same document. It seeks comment on two discrete issues. First, it seeks comment on potential mechanisms to ensure that erroneously blocked numbers can be unblocked as quickly as possible. We all hope that there aren't going to be a lot of errors in blocking calls based on the kinds of phone numbers that I've just described. But if that does occur, we're asking about what the formal challenge mechanism should be. Should the mechanism be different based on the size of the carrier? What challenge mechanisms are carriers or service providers already using or considering to use? Is there a process beyond our current informal complaints process that should be used to help sort out these erroneously blocked calls, if any? And another thing that's probably kind of important is, how should callers be informed when their calls are already blocked or are being blocked? They won't know, of course, to challenge those calls if they believe their calls are lawful unless they know they're being blocked. And then, how can we assure that calls will be unblocked if blocked in error? What kind of credible claim needs to be made by the caller to make that known to the providers who are doing the blocking? And kind of the flip side of that is, how do we prevent abuse of the challenge mechanism? We certainly don't want unlawful robocallers to be challenging the blocking of their calls, and yet you can see very easily that there'd be an incentive to do that. And then finally, should there be a mandated time frame for unblocking calls that have been blocked in error? The second thing the further notice seeks comment on is the ways to measure the effectiveness of the FCC's robocalling efforts, as well as the efforts of the industry. Should we adopt a reporting obligation for voice service providers, for example? And if so, what kind of information should be collected? Should we ask them to provide information about false positives when they've blocked calls in error, for example? How often should information be reported? Annually, quarterly? How would the data help us evaluate the effectiveness of the blocking that's going on? What are the consumer benefits? How can we measure that? And then what's the cost of any reporting that we might require? And should small providers have some different obligation as far as reporting goes? An alternative is using data that we already have from our Consumer Complaint Center that does provide us with a lot of good information already. And the question is really, do we need more information than that? And then what other data sources are there? The comment period has just closed toward the end of last week on February 22nd, but we expect that interested parties will still come in to do ex parte presentations, during the time when the commission's looking at the record. And then finally, in the November item, as I said, we were directed, our bureau was directed to draft a report in consultation with the FTC on the state of robocalling in the U.S. It told us some specific things that the Commission would like us to do. One is shed light on the issue of robocalling generally and how that information can inform FCC actions going forward. They'd like the report to encompass both progress made by the industry, also by government, also by consumers in combating illegal robocalls. I think we've all played a part so far, and the Commission wants to know where things stand with that, as well as looking at the remaining challenges to continuing and improving these efforts along the way. We're also being asked to focus on quantitative data as much as possible. That would include calling trends and consumer complaints, which we think should provide some insight into the current state of the robocalling problem, how to target additional measures to help consumers avoid the kind of fraud and annoyance that they're already experiencing. The report's due to the Commission next January. And that pretty much sums up the November report and order and further notice. The last slide is Karen Schroeder's email address and phone number if you have questions, but really feel free to call me or any of the managers in the Consumer Policy Division if you have questions, as well as Karen, who was the author of the item. So anyway, with that, should I open it up for questions? Yeah, if there are any questions, I'll be glad to
Susan?
answer them.
Hi, Susan Grant from Consumer Federation of America. So in preparing this report, will you be asking all of the carriers what measures they have implemented so far? I note that even in the in allowing carriers to block these calls that seem pretty obvious on their face to be fraudulent, it's not a requirement. So some carriers will do this, others may not. Will you be getting more than just a general report from industry associations, but actually hard numbers from the carriers themselves about what steps they've taken, how many consumers have signed up if that's required, or exactly what each of them is doing, so that we can compare between carriers?
Yeah, that's certainly the kind of information we're hoping to get. At this point, I can't say that we're looking to require carriers to provide certain information, but as we work out the process for gathering the information, we're going to be looking for carriers as well as just the public at large to provide us with the information we need there. We may, this hasn't been decided finally yet, but we may, for example, issue a public notice asking for comment.
Francella? Did you, or is that up from last time? Oh,
From last time.
sorry. That's okay. Anybody on the phone have any questions or comments?
Yeah. This is Ken McEldowney from Consumer Action. I guess I'm very surprised by the response to the answer to Susan's question. I just can't imagine how the FCC's efforts can be effective without requiring that data from the carriers. I would think that the carriers that were doing a great job would voluntarily come forward. The ones that were doing less than a great job would not come forward. So the problem would continue.
Well, yeah, that's certainly something we're going to need to consider as we gather information. As I mentioned, we haven't made a final decision about exactly how to gather the information. One option is issuing a public notice. The responses to the public notice, of course, would be voluntary. If we don't see information coming in that we think would be essential to drafting the report, we may have to take further steps to gather that information. Other questions?
Other questions on the phone? I would add before you leave that there is a wealth of knowledge and a diversity of backgrounds right here at this table, and if you find ways that we can be helpful in getting you information or other ways that we can be helpful as you work to assemble this report, please feel free to call on us, reach out to Scott or myself. We're always happy to form a small group, a large group, whatever makes the most sense, and be as helpful as we can.
Well, thank you. We'll certainly keep that in mind and take you up on it.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay. Next on the agenda, we have we have a recommendation that is for consideration, and this recommendation came through the efforts of the robocall working group. The focus of the recommendation is on call authentication technology and tools primarily, but it also has some other action items that are focused on combating robocalls more broadly. It was sent around to the full CAC in advance of the meeting, and I believe there is a copy in each folder, correct, Scott? Yes. Kevin, did you want to say anything in regards to the recommendation? Sorry to put you on the spot, but Kevin's the co-chair with myself of the working group, so I thought we could.
No, I think you covered it very well, Ed, and I'll just say I definitely appreciate all the efforts within that working group to focus on this issue. Caller ID authentication is certainly a key aspect in the fight against robocalls. And, as you look through the recommendation that we did put together, we talk about, the narrative, the lead-in narrative provides an overview as to why spoofing is such a challenge in the robocall space, in addition to fooling consumers and, giving them false information that may make them more likely to fall for a scam. The ability of these bad actors to spoof the numbers also makes it more challenging for the blocking services and labeling services that are out there to, stay on top of this ever-changing series of numbers. And then finally, with spoofing, it does make it that more challenging for law enforcement to trace these calls back so that we can find the folks that are behind these calls. But the group did put together a good series of recommendations to the FCC. And as Ed noted, we kind of put them into two buckets. We have, the first set of 3 recommendations that are focused more on the caller ID authentication and shake and stir, and then the last 5 set of recommendations that are focused on robocalling more broadly. And happy to discuss or answer any questions that folks may have on those.
Can we first get a motion to move the recommendation to the floor? Krista, thank you. Julie, seconded. Thank you. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Moving it to the floor. Okay, discussion.
I just want to thank this group for working so hard on this recommendation. I think it just goes to the fact that this CAC has worked so hard on the front end to put these recommendations together that we have nothing to say. It's perfect. Thank you.
So Krista just took your chance if you planned on saying anything. So does anyone want to call the question? Debbie calls the question. So, all in favor of the recommendation?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Katie's abstaining.
One abstention?
Yep. All right, so that passes. Thank you, everyone. Yes, so now we have a little bit of an expanded opportunity for our working group time. We'd like to structure this in a way that allows people to participate in multiple working groups, because I know there are a number of CAC members who are also members of multiple working groups. Unfortunately, we do get to do a little bit of field tripping today because the conference rooms closest to us were unavailable, so everybody gets to get a map and a compass. And Scott and Catherine will be leading people to the harder the harder conference rooms to locate within the building.
402, 442, which we usually use, is right down the hall to my right, and then it'll be on your left after you pass the intersecting corridor. So we do have that room on the 12th Street level, and then the other rooms will have to go to the other floors, and USF will stay in here.
Okay, so our plan is going to be that the broadcast repack working group and the slamming and cramming working groups will be the first two working groups during the time block that we have. And those groups will meet from when we leave the room now until about 1:50.
Repack and which?
And those are also the two working groups that are the furthest away. So we're going to take you far away in the hopes that when we have the second two, you're close and we can just dive right back in and wrap up the meeting for the day. So, broadcast repack and slamming and cramming. Broadcast repack is going to be in West Room 3C-858, and Catherine will lead you there.
Right.
The slamming and cramming working group is going to be in West Room 1C-858, and Scott
That's correct.
will be leading everyone there. At 1:50, we'll switch, and the second part of the time block will be devoted to the robocalls working group and the USF Digital Inclusion working group. The robocalls group will be just down the hall in A405/442. That's
Right.
the one that we frequently use for these meetings. And the USF group will be here in the CRM, as is standard operating procedure for that group. So,
And once you get up into your rooms, we'd like the working group leaders to establish the conference call bridge, and you do that with the information that's on the sheet in your packets, just as you would if you were doing an ordinary off-site conference call with your group. And also, if you need the people on the upper floors, that's behind a locked door. So if you need to get out and need to return, give Catherine a call on her phone, and if you could jot this number down, we didn't put that in the sheet, we should have. It's 202-853-6204, 202-853-6204, and she will come up and let you in and out of the suite area if you need to exit for any reason and return.
so quickly, let's have a 5-minute comfort break. The tour guides will depart at 1:15 from this room to take you to your meeting location.
And tips are always welcome. No, I'm teasing.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. Thank you for taking time to participate in the working group meetings. I hope that everyone found them to be productive and had a chance to have a good discussion. So as we come back to the room, the next thing on our agenda is to have some report outs from those working group meetings. We'll start with Steve and the repack working group.
All right. So there was an idea that came up, so we're going to be looking into it. And it's, well, with the Commerce Committee a passage of the Ray Baum Act, it's H.R. 4986, there would potentially be dollars set aside for a consumer education fund. And that education and outreach to consumers would be in connection with the FCC's coordinating the education deal on the channel repacking. So we're going to be thinking about and potentially working on a recommendation that would have some principles on how that money might be best spent. maybe efficiently or coordinating with other groups on the ground to reach consumers that are affected by the transition or most affected, including those with disabilities and others, potentially grassroots coordination and broadcasters and so on. So that's sort of the broad idea that we're going to be looking into. And if the bill does move, then we also hope to get some sort of presentation from the FCC on the lessons they've learned from the TV transition to see if there's anything that we might be thinking about as we look closer into this issue. But that's sort of the task right now. And that's all we have.
Okay. Thank you. USF.
This is Amina Bazlula. We had a great short call and in-person meeting. We've decided to put together a Lifeline recommendation, refresh our original recommendations for the docket, the current Lifeline docket. And right now we're unclear on timing, so we're going to check in with FCC staff to figure out timing, but it's possible that we'll be able to utilize the upcoming June meeting to pass through the recommendation, but there may be some need, depending on timing for the order on Lifeline, to request a phone meeting to pass through the full CAC. So that's it right now.
Okay. And are you guys envisioning new language or just...
Some new language and some refresh.
Okay,
yep.
Great. All right, so we'll look forward to that.
Is this to submit in the current NPRM?
Correct. Yeah. So there's initial comments just closed. Replies
Last week
are open for another month, and then depending on when the order comes out and Sunshine kicks in, or is set to come out and Sunshine will kick in, we may be able to still place our recommendation. So that's what we're aiming for, is that sort of period after replies.
So is there a possibility we might have to consider this before our next meeting then?
That's right. Okay. So we may be able to make it for June, but there's a possibility we'll need to do a phone call before.
Any other questions? Okay. Susan, did you want to do slamming and cramming?
Sure. So there is an open proceeding on slamming and cramming in which consumer organizations and carriers and others have shared their perspectives on the extent of the problem and what should be done about it, or the problems. And there are very divergent views in those comments, and those have been reflected in our breaking group conversations as well. But I think there are some areas in which we can converge on a recommendation, which we'll be working on. One is consumer education. More could be done about that. I think robocalls is the sexy topic of the moment, and it was interesting to hear this morning about all the different materials that are going to be rolled out about that. I'm not clear on whether some of those new materials will also be about slamming and cramming, but I personally would love to see some more innovative consumer education materials in that regard, and I think that's a view that's shared in the breaking group. So we will talk about consumer education in a possible recommendation. Also making the difference between slamming and cramming more understandable on the FCC consumer complaint form. This is kind of a challenge because we have a sort of hybrid type of complaint now where consumers in some cases are being charged for a third party's phone service on their bill, whether or not they've actually been switched to that phone company. So it's kind of a hybrid of slamming and cramming. And it's important for the FCC to have as good as information as is possible in order to quantify these problems. We want to probably encourage the FCC to continue focusing its enforcement efforts to combat the problem. So that would be the third thing that we may touch on. And then finally, one of the proposals in the FCC's notice is about banning misrepresentations in sales of telephone service. Surprisingly, there isn't any rule that says that is illegal, but it seems like a good idea. I think related to that is the question of how long the carrier should keep records of the sales call. Most carriers make recordings of sales calls, but they can be costly to retain in the volume of those calls that are made over a long period of time. So we talked about what would be a reasonable period of time to keep those recordings. And hopefully we'll be able to reach consensus about that. And in regard to banning misrepresentations, one of the concerns that carriers expressed was about strict liability. They wouldn't want to be liable for individual incidents that may happen, rather than something that points to a systemic problem. So it sounds like we may be able to make a suggestion in that regard to resolve that concern and support the idea of banning these misrepresentations.
Any questions? Thank you. Robocalls. So I'll throw it to you, Kevin, since I've talked a lot today.
Fair enough. Thank you, Ed. So we had a good meeting of the working group, the robocalls working group, and among the topics we discussed, we did talk about whether there's any areas that we can work on with respect to the upcoming January 2019 report. With that coming down the line. Two other areas, though, that there seemed to be a lot of interest in was talk about two separate issues. First, robocall enforcement and looking at if there's ways that we can talk about and encourage stronger law enforcement efforts against some of these bad actors. The main point being there that while we have certainly applauded a lot of the good enforcement work that the FCC has done as well as the FTC, that's civil enforcement. So we want to explore whether there are ways we can encourage either or both agencies to, perhaps partner with criminal law enforcement efforts so that, instead of slapping a fine on a bad actor that may or may not be paid, we put people behind bars where, quite frankly, they belong given the substantial financial harm that can result from these activities. The other area that we wanted to look at was in the area of that's teed up in the further notice, in the FCC's robocalling further notice, in the area of false positives, particularly with respect to some of the third-party services that are out there. So in other words, when you have whether it's a small business or a consumer that because of the nature of spoofing, their number has been spoofed, and now they're being blocked or labeled on a service that's out there, a consumer opt-in service. What are some of the ways that they can resolve that dispute? So I think those are the two areas that we were looking at, and if I missed anything, Ed?
No, I think that's
chime in.
Spot on.
All right.
And I think the sad news is that it's not over, and we'll continue to look for other ways we can be helpful to the Commission in the space of robocalls.
Absolutely.
So next on our agenda, we have a block of time for comments from the public. I'm not sure if we got any in advance of that this time, Scott. Okay.
I assume we didn't get anything in the social media channels, or we would have heard about that.
Not really. Okay. And then there were a couple people who flagged me today to mention upcoming events that are relevant for many of us at the table. So I want to give all those folks a chance to sort of share what they have coming up. We'll start with Barry.
Sure. Thanks, Ed. A couple years ago, the wonderful people who brought you the Digital Policy Institute created the Telecommunications Research and Policy Institute, and we are getting ready to unveil on March 7th the triennial update to something called the Net Vitality Report. It's something that Stuart Broadband, who many of you know, he was been at Brookings, Harvard, actually was instrumental in creating the old Office of Telecommunications Policy, the predecessor to NTIA. He's done this report a couple times in the past. It is the only one of its kind. It compares the country-by-country leaders in the Internet in terms of applications, speed, services, and it's a 2-volume set. The first volume will be unleashed at a press conference at the National Press Club the morning of March 7th. It's a Wednesday. We'll have copies there, and it'll be available online shortly thereafter. And then in June, we'll have a second volume, which is the statistical basis for the conclusions in the first report. That should be out around June. I'd like to perhaps have a further discussion, a little more substantive, at the June meeting of the CAC. Ed, thanks.
Thank you. Susan.
Consumer Federation's annual conference, Consumer Assembly, will be May 10th and 11th at the Embassy Suites Convention Center Hotel in downtown D.C. And in the afternoon of the 10th, there will be a session about the progress and the challenges that remain concerning robocalls and also other issues that have come up in the application of the Telephone Consumer Protection Act to various kinds of calls. So I invite you all to come.
Amina.
Hi, NDIA will be holding Net Inclusion April 17th through 19th in Cleveland, Ohio. And there will be a number of tracks, some of them focusing on USF issues and other digital inclusion issues as well.
Thank you. Scott and I have sort of looked at the year ahead, and our charter expires in late October. So with the idea of getting times locked in for next meetings, we've flagged 2 possible dates in both June and October for meetings. So Scott, can you share those dates with the...
Sure. June 8th and 11th in June, and October 15th and 19th for the October last meeting of this term. One of those dates is a Monday and the other one's a Friday. I can tell you exactly if you give me a minute here, which is which.
The 8th is a Friday.
The 8th is a Friday, okay. And then the 11th is the Monday. Mm-hmm. And I think the 15th is a Monday and the 19th is the Friday.
Yeah.
The 15th is not the holiday?
No, it is the 8th.
The 8th is the holiday?
According to the calendar program I use. So.
Okay.
Yep,
you're right.
This is Julie.
And I was able to pre-reserve this room, so that would not have been possible if it was a federal holiday.
Yeah, Scott, this
Yes.
is Julie. I think the 11th is the M-Enabling Summit, the 11th of June, the Monday, just as an FYI.
I don't want to compete with that, that's for sure.
Thank you, Julie.
All right, well, that makes the
So
decision.
it looks like the 8th in June, and then the 15th and 19th are out there. If you have a conflict or your organization has an event Please let Scott and I know sooner rather than later, and we will try to finalize these 2 dates.
Yep.
But for the time being, if you could sort of tentatively hold those spaces in your calendar, that would be much appreciated. If you have any feedback about today's programming or the topics that we covered, if you have a request and a burning desire to learn more about public safety, we can connect you with a number of the speakers who presented today. I thought it was a very good agenda, very interesting. But please let us know what your thoughts were. And thank you all for spending the better part of a day
Indeed.
with us.
Thank
we
you
appreciate
very
it.
much. Thank you.
So I will
Safe
entertain
travel.
a motion to adjourn.
Go, run.
Second.
Don't walk.
In favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
Stay.
Abstentions? Yeah, exactly.
Nobody's going to
Thank you.
abstain? I mean, come on now. Really? Okay.
I have. Have you read it?
I'm about
Steve, thanks, man.
Do we have?
I haven't heard any debate. I knew they said that.
Yeah.
I did like it.
Take care. So long.
You too.
It's like, it just seems so much